Author's Preface of Good Sense, or Free Thoughts Opposed to Supernatural Ideas, by Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense, or Free Thoughts Opposed to Supernatural Ideas, by Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. The Author's Preface. When we examine the opinions of men, we find that nothing is more uncommon than common sense, or, in other words, they lack judgment to discover plain truths or to reject absurdities and palpable contradictions. We have an example of this in theology, a system revered in all countries by a great number of men, an object regarded by them as most important and indispensable to happiness. An examination of the principles upon which this pretended system is founded forces us to acknowledge that these principles are only suppositions, imagined by ignorance, propagated by enthusiasm or knavery, adopted by timid credulity, preserved by custom which never reasons, and revered solely because not understood. In a word, whoever uses common sense upon religious opinions, and will bestow on this inquiry the attention that is commonly given to most subjects, will easily perceive that religion is a mere castle in the air. Theology is ignorance of natural causes, a tissue of fallacies and contradictions. In every country it presents romances void of probability, the hero of which is composed of impossible qualities. His name, exciting fear in all minds, is only a vague word, to which men affix ideas or qualities, which are either contradicted by facts or inconsistent. Notions of this being, or rather the word by which he is designated, would be a matter of indifference, if it did not cause innumerable ravages in the world. But men, prepossessed with the opinion that this phantom is a reality of the greatest interest, instead of concluding wisely from its incomprehensibility that they are not bound to regard it, infer, on the contrary, that they must contemplate it, without ceasing, and never lose sight of it. Their invincible ignorance upon this subject irritates their curiosity. Instead of putting them upon guard against their imagination, this ignorance renders them decisive, dogmatic, imperious, and even exasperates them against all who oppose doubts to the reveries which they have begotten. What perplexity arises, when it is required to solve an insolvable problem! Unceasing meditation upon an object, impossible to understand, but in which, however he thinks himself much concerned, cannot but excite man, and produce a fever in his brain. Let interest, vanity, and ambition cooperate ever so little with this unfortunate turn of mind, and society must necessarily be disturbed. This is the reason that so many nations have often been the scene of extravagances of senseless visionaries, who, believing their empty speculations to be eternal truths, and publishing them as such, have kindled the zeal of princes and their subjects, and made them take up arms for opinions, represented to them as essential to the glory of the Deity. In all parts of our globe, fanatics have cut each other's throats, publicly burnt each other, committed without a scruple and even as a duty the greatest crimes, and shed torrents of blood. For what? To strengthen, support, or propagate the impertinent conjectures of some enthusiasts, or to give validity to the cheats of impostors, in the name of a being who exists only in their imagination, and who has made himself known only by the ravages, disputes, and follies he has caused. Savage and furious nations, perpetually at war, adore, under diverse names, some god, conformable to their ideas, that is to say, cruel, carnivorous, selfish, bloodthirsty. We find in all the religions a God of armies, a jealous God, an avenging God, a destroying God, a God who is pleased with carnage, and whom his worshippers consider it a duty to serve. Lambs, bull, children, men and women, are sacrificed to him. Zealous servants of this barbarous God think themselves obliged even to offer up themselves as a sacrifice to him. Madmen may everywhere be seen, who, after meditating upon their terrible God, imagine that to please him they must inflict on themselves the most exquisite torments. The gloomy ideas formed of the Deity, far from consoling them, have everywhere disquieted their minds, and prejudiced follies destructive to happiness. How could the human mind progress, while tormented with frightful phantoms, and guided by men interested in perpetuating its ignorance and fears? Man has been forced to vegetate in his primitive stupidity. He has been taught stories about invisible powers upon whom his happiness was supposed to depend. Occupied solely by his fears, and by unintelligible reveries, he has always been at the mercy of priests, who have reserved to themselves the right of thinking for him, and of directing his actions. Thus man has remained a slave without courage, fearing to reason, and unable to extricate himself from the labyrinth in which he has been wandering. He believes himself forced under the yoke of his gods, known to him only by the fabulous accounts given by his ministers, who, after binding each unhappy mortal in the chains of prejudice, remain his masters, or else abandon him defenseless in the absolute power of tyrants, no less terrible than the gods, of whom they are the representatives. Oppressed by the double yoke of spiritual and temporal power, it has been impossible for the people to be happy. Religion became sacred, and men have had no other morality than what their legislators and priests brought from the unknown regions of heaven. The human mind, confused by theological opinions, ceased to know its own powers, mistrusted experience, feared truth and disdained reason, in order to follow authority. Man has been a mere machine in the hands of tyrants and priests. Always treated as a slave, man has contracted the vices of slavery. Such are the true causes of the corruption of morals. Ignorance and servitude are calculated to make men wicked and unhappy. Knowledge, reason, and liberty can alone reform and make men happier. But everything conspires to blind them, and to confirm their errors. Priests cheat them, tyrants corrupt and enslave them. Tyranny ever was and ever will be the true cause of man's depravity, and also of his calamities. Almost always fascinated by religious fiction, poor mortals turn not their eyes to the natural and obvious causes of their misery, but attribute their vices to the imperfection of their natures, and their unhappiness to the anger of the gods. They offer to heaven vows, sacrifices, and presents, to obtain the end of sufferings, which, in reality, are attributable only to the negligence, ignorance, and perversity of their guides, to the folly of their customs, and, above all, to the general want of knowledge. Let men's minds be filled with true ideas, let their reason be cultivated, and there will be no need of opposing to the passions such a feeble barrier as the fear of gods. Men will be good when they are well instructed, and when they are despised for evil, or justly rewarded for good, which they do to their fellow citizens. In vain should we attempt to cure men of their vices, unless we begin by curing them of their prejudices. It is only by showing them the truth that they will perceive their true interests, and the real motives that ought to incline them to do good. Instructors have long enough fixed men's eyes upon heaven, let them now turn them upon earth. An incomprehensible theology, ridiculous fables, impenetrable mysteries, puerile ceremonies are to be no longer endured. Let the human mind apply itself to what is natural, to intelligible objects, truth, and useful knowledge. Does it not suffice to annihilate religious prejudice, to show that what is inconceivable to man cannot be good for him? Does it require anything but plain common sense to perceive that a being incompatible with the most evident notions, that a cause continually opposed to the effects which we attribute to it, that a being of whom we can say nothing without falling into contradiction, that a being, who, far from explaining the enigmas of the universe, only makes them more inexplicable, that a being, whom for so many ages men have vainly addressed to obtain their happiness and the end of sufferings, does it require, I say, anything but plain common sense to perceive that the idea of such a being is an idea without model, and that he himself is merely a phantom of the imagination? Is anything necessary but common sense to perceive, at least, that it is folly and madness for men to hate and damn one another about unintelligible opinions concerning a being of this kind? In short, does not everything prove that morality and virtue are totally incompatible with the notions of a God whom his ministers and interpreters have described in every country as the most capricious, unjust, and cruel of tyrants, whose pretended will, however, must serve as law and rule the inhabitants of the earth? To discover the true principles of morality, men have no need of theology, of revelation, or of gods. They have need only of common sense. They have only to commune with themselves, to reflect upon their own nature, to consider the objects of society and of the individuals who compose it, and they will easily perceive that virtue is advantageous and vice disadvantageous to themselves. Let us persuade men to be just, beneficent, moderate, sociable, not because such conduct is demanded by the gods, but because it is pleasant to men. Let us advise them to abstain from vice and crime, not because they will be punished in another world, but because they will suffer for it in this. These are, says Montesquieu, means to prevent crimes, these are punishments, these reform manners, these are good examples. The way of truth is straight, that of imposture is crooked and dark. Truth, ever necessary to man, must necessarily be felt by all upright minds. The lessons of reason are to be followed by all honest men. Men are unhappy only because they are ignorant. They are ignorant only because everything conspires to prevent their being enlightened. They are wicked only because their reason is not sufficiently developed. By what fatality, then, have the first founders of all sects given to their gods ferocious characters, at which nature revolts? Can we imagine a conduct more abominable than that which Moses tells us his God showed toward the Egyptians, where that assassin proceeds boldly to declare, in the name and by the order of his God, that Egypt shall be afflicted with the greatest calamities that can happen to man? Of all the different ideas which they give us of a supreme being, of a God, creator and preserver of mankind, there are none more horrible than those of the impostors, who represented themselves as inspired by a divine spirit, and "Thus saith the Lord." Why, O theologians, do you presume to inquire into the impenetrable mysteries of a being whom you consider inconceivable to the human mind? You are the blasphemers, when you imagine that a being, perfect according to you, could be guilty of such cruelty towards creatures he has made out of nothing. Confess your ignorance of a creating God, and cease meddling with mysteries, which are repugnant to common sense. End of preface. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 1 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 1. Parts 1 through 10. Part 1. Apologue. There is a vast empire, governed by a monarch, whose strange conduct is to confound the minds of his subjects. He wishes to be known, loved, respected, obeyed, but never shows himself to his subjects, and everything conspires to render uncertain the ideas formed of his character. The people, subjected to his power, have, of the character and laws of their invisible sovereign, such ideas only as his ministers give them. They, however, confess that they have no idea of their master, that his ways are impenetrable, his views and nature totally incomprehensible. These ministers likewise disagree upon the commands which they pretend have been issued by the sovereign, whose servants they call themselves. They defame one another, and mutually treat each other as impostors and false teachers. The decrees and ordinances they take upon themselves to promulgate are obscure. They are enigmas, little calculated to be understood or even divined by the subjects, for whose instruction they were intended. The laws of the concealed monarch require interpreters, but the interpreters are always disputing upon the true manner of understanding them. Besides, they are not consistent with themselves. All they relate of their concealed prince is only a string of contradictions. They utter concerning him not a single word that does not immediately confute itself. They call him supremely good, yet many complain of his decrees. They suppose him infinitely wise, and under his administration everything appears to contradict reason. They extol his justice, and the best of his subjects are generally the least favored. They assert he sees everything, yet his presence avails nothing. He is, say they, the friend of order, yet throughout his dominions all is in confusion and disorder. He makes all for himself, and the events seldom answer his designs. He foresees everything, but cannot prevent anything. He impatiently suffers offence, yet gives everyone the power of offending him. Men admire the wisdom and perfection of his works, yet his works, full of imperfection, are of short duration. He is continually doing and undoing, repairing what he has made, but is never pleased with his work. In all his undertakings he proposes only his own glory, yet is never glorified. His only end is the happiness of his subjects, and his subjects for the most part want necessaries. Those whom he seems to favor are generally least satisfied with their fate. Almost all appear in perpetual revolt against a master, whose greatness they never cease to admire, whose wisdom to extol, whose goodness to adore, whose justice to fear, and whose laws to reverence, though never obeyed. The empire is the world; this monarch, God; his ministers are the priests; his subjects, mankind. 2. What is theology? There is a science that has for its object only things incomprehensible. Contrary to all other sciences, it treats only of what cannot fall under our senses. Hobbes calls it the kingdom of darkness. It is a country where everything is governed by laws, contrary to those which mankind are permitted to know in the world they inhabit. In this marvelous region, light is only darkness, evidence is doubtful or false, impossibilities are credible, reason is a deceitful guide, and good sense becomes madness. This science is called theology, and this theology is a continual insult to the reason of man. 3. What is theology? By the magical power of ifs, buts, perhapses, what do we know, etc., heaped together, a shapeless and unconnected system is formed, perplexing mankind by obliterating from their minds the most clear ideas and rendering uncertain truths most evident. By reason of this systematic confusion, nature is an enigma. The visible world has disappeared, to give place to regions invisible. Reason is compelled to yield to imagination, who leads to the country of her self-invented chimeras. 4. Man is not born with any ideas of religion. The principles of every religion are founded upon the ideas of a God. Now, it is impossible to have true ideas of a being who acts upon none of our senses. All our ideas are representations of sensible objects. What then can represent to us the idea of God, which is evidently an idea without an object? Is not such an idea as impossible as an effect without a cause? Can an idea without an archetype be anything but a chimera? There are, however, divines, who assure us that the idea of God is innate, or that we have this idea in our mother's womb. Every principle is the result of reason. All reason is the effect of experience. Experience is acquired only by the exercise of our senses. Therefore, religious principles are not founded upon reason, and are not innate. 5. It is not necessary to believe in a God. Every system of religion can be founded only upon the nature of God and man, and upon the relations which subsist between them. But to judge of the reality of those relations, we must have some idea of the divine nature. Now the world exclaims the divine nature is incomprehensible to man, yet ceases not to assign attributes to this incomprehensible God, and to assure us that it is our indispensable duty to find out that God whom it is impossible to comprehend. The most important concern of man is what he can least comprehend. If God is incomprehensible to man, it would seem reasonable never to think of him. But religion maintains, man cannot with impunity cease a moment to think, or rather dream, of his God. 6. Religion is founded on credulity. We are told that divine qualities are not of a nature to be comprehended by finite minds. The natural consequence must be, that divine qualities are not made to occupy finite minds. But religion tells us, that the poor finite mind of man ought never to lose sight of an inconceivable being, whose qualities he can never comprehend. Thus, we see, religion is the art of turning the attention of mankind upon subjects they can never comprehend. 7. All religion is an absurdity. Religion unites man with God, or forms a communication between them. Yet do they not say, God is infinite? If God be infinite, no finite being can have communication or relation with him. Where there is no relation, there can be no union, communication, or duties. If there be no duties between man and his God, there is no religion for man. Thus, in saying God is infinite, you annihilate religion for man, who is a finite being. The idea of infinity is to us an idea without model, without archetype, without object. 8. the idea of God is impossible. If God be an infinite being, there cannot be, either in the present or future world, any relative proportion between man and his God. Thus the idea of God can never enter the human mind. In supposition of a life in which man would be much more enlightened than in this, the idea of the infinity of God would ever remain the same distance from his finite mind. Thus the idea of God will be no more clear in the future than in the present life. Thus intelligences, superior to man, can have no more complete ideas of God than man, who has not the least conception of him in his present life. 9. On the origin of superstition. How has it been possible to persuade reasonable beings that the thing most impossible to comprehend was most essential to them? It is because they have been greatly terrified, because when they fear they cease to reason, because they have been taught to mistrust their own understanding, because, when the brain is troubled, they believe everything and examine nothing. 10. On the origin of all religion. Ignorance and fear are the two hinges of all religion. The uncertainty in which man finds himself in relation to his God is precisely the motive that attaches him to his religion. Man is fearful in the dark, in moral as well as physical darkness. His fear becomes habitual, and habit makes it natural. He would think that he wanted something, if he had nothing to fear. End of section 1. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 2 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 2, Parts 11 through 24. 11. Religious fears expose men to become a prey to impostors. He who from infancy has habituated himself to tremble when he hears pronounced certain words, requires those words and needs to tremble. He is therefore more disposed to listen to one who entertains him in his fears, than to one who dissuades him from them. The superstitious man wishes to fear. His imagination demands it. One might say that he fears nothing so much as to have nothing to fear. Men are imaginary invalids, whose weakness empirics are interested to encourage in order to have sale for their drugs. They listen rather to the physician who prescribes a variety of remedies than to him who recommends good regimen and leaves nature to herself. 12. Religion seduces ignorance by the aid of the marvelous. If religion were more clear, it would have less charms for the ignorant, who are pleased only with obscurity, terrors, fables, prodigies, and things incredible. Romances, silly stories, and the tales of ghosts and wizards are more pleasing to vulgar minds than true histories. 13. Religion seduces ignorance by the aid of the marvelous. In point of religion, men are only great children. The more a religion is absurd and filled with wonders, the greater ascendancy it acquires over them. The devout man thinks himself obliged to place no bounds to his credulity. The more things are inconceivable, they appear to him divine. The more they are incredible, the greater merit, he imagines, there is in believing them. 14. No religion, if not ages of stupidity and barbarism. The origin of religious opinions is generally dated from the time when savage nations were yet in infancy. It was to gross, ignorant, and stupid people that the founders of religion have in all ages addressed themselves, when they wished to give them their gods, their mode of worship, their mythology, their marvellous and frightful fables. These chimeras, adopted without exclamation by parents, are transmitted, with more or less alteration, to their children, who seldom reason any more than their parents. 15. All religion was produced by the desire of domination. The object of the first legislators was to govern the people, and the easiest method to effect it was to terrify their minds, and to prevent the exercise of reason. They led them through winding by-paths, lest they might perceive the designs of their guides. They forced them to fix their eyes in the air, for fear they should look at their feet. They amused them on the way with idle stories. In a word, they treated them as nurses do children, who sing lullabies to put them to sleep, and scold to make them quiet. 16. What serves as a basis to religion is most uncertain. The existence of a God is the basis of all religion. Few appear to doubt his existence, yet this fundamental article utterly embarrasses every mind that reasons. The first question of every catechism has been, and ever will be, the most difficult to resolve. In the year 1701, the Holy Fathers of the Oratory of Vendôme maintained in a thesis this proposition, that, according to St. Thomas, the existence of God is not, and cannot be, a subject of faith. 17. It is impossible to be convinced of the existence of a God. Can we imagine ourselves sincerely convinced of the existence of a being, whose nature we know not, who is inaccessible to all our senses, whose attributes, we are assured, are incomprehensible to us? To persuade me that a being exists or can exist, I must be first told what that being is. To induce me to believe the existence or the possibility of such a being, it is necessary to tell me things concerning him that are not contradictory, and do not destroy one another. In short, to fully convince me of the existence of that being, it is necessary to tell me things that I can understand. 18. It is impossible to be convinced of the existence of a God. A thing is impossible when it includes two ideas that mutually destroy one another, and which can neither be conceived nor united in thought. Conviction can be founded only upon the constant testimony of our senses, which alone give birth to our ideas, and enable us to judge of the agreement or disagreement. That, which exists necessarily, is that whose non-existence implies a contradiction. These principles, universally acknowledged, become erroneous, when applied to the existence of a God. Whatever has been hitherto said upon the subject is either unintelligible or perfect contradiction, and must therefore appear absurd to every rational man. 19. The existence of God is not proved. All human knowledge is more or less clear. By what strange fatality have we never been able to elucidate the science of God? The most civilized nations, and among them the most profound thinkers, are in this respect no more enlightened than the most savage tribes and ignorant peasants; and, examining the subject closely, we shall find, that by the speculations and subtle refinements of men, the divine science has been only more and more obscured. Every religion has hitherto been founded only upon what is called, in logic, begging the question. It takes things for granted, and then proves by suppositions instead of principles. 20. It explains nothing to say that God is a spirit. Metaphysics teach us that God is a pure spirit. But is modern theology superior to that of the savages? The savages acknowledge a Great Spirit for the master of the world. The savages, like all ignorant people, attribute to spirits all the effects, of which their experience cannot discover the true causes. Ask a savage what works your watch. He will answer, it is a spirit. Ask the divines what moves the universe. They answer, it is a spirit. 21. Spirituality is an absurdity. The savage, when he speaks of a spirit, affixes at least some idea to the word. He means thereby an agent, like the air, the breeze, the breath, that invisibly produces discernible effects. By subtilizing everything, the modern theologian becomes as unintelligible to himself as to others. Ask him what he understands by a spirit. He will answer you that it is an unknown substance, perfectly simple, that has no extension, that has nothing common with matter. Indeed, is there any one who can form the least idea of such a substance? What then is a spirit, to speak in the language of modern theology, but the absence of an idea? The idea of spirituality is an idea without model. 22. Whatever exists is derived from matter. Is it not more natural and intelligible to draw universal existence from the matter whose existence is demonstrated by all the senses, and whose effects we experience, which we see act, move, communicate motion, and incessantly generate, than to attribute the formation of things to an unknown power, to a spiritual being, who cannot derive from his nature what he is not himself, and who, by his spiritual essence, can create neither matter nor motion? Nothing is more evident than that the idea they endeavour to give us, of the action of mind upon matter, represents no object. It is an idea without model. 23. What is the metaphysical God of modern theology? The material Jupiter of the ancients could move, compose, destroy, and create beings similar to himself. But the God of modern theology is sterile. He can neither occupy any place in space, nor move matter, nor form a visible world, nor create men or gods. The metaphysical God is fit only to produce confusion, reveries, follies, and disputes. 24. Less unreasonable to adore the sun than adore a spiritual deity. Since a God was indispensably requisite to men, why did they not worship the sun, that visible God, adored by so many nations? What being had greater claim to the homage of men than the day-star, who enlightens, warms, and vivifies all beings, whose presence enlivens and regenerates nature, whose absence seems to cast her into gloom and languor? If any being announced to mankind power, activity, beneficence, and duration, it was certainly the sun, whom they ought to have regarded as the parent of nature, as the divinity. At least they could not without folly dispute his existence, or refuse to acknowledge his influence. End of section 2. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 3 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 3, parts 25 through 38. 25. A spiritual deity is incapable of volition and action. The theologian exclaims to us that God wants neither hands nor arms to act, that he acts by his will. But pray who or what is that God who has a will, and what can be the subject of his divine will? Are the stories of witches, ghosts, wizards, hobgoblins, etc., more absurd and difficult to believe than the magical or impossible action of mind upon matter? When we admit such a God, fables and reveries may claim belief. Theologians treat men as children, whose simplicity makes them believe all the stories they hear. 26. What is God? To shake the existence of God, we need only to ask a theologian to speak of him. As soon as he has said a word upon the subject, the least reflection will convince us that his observations are totally incompatible with the essence he ascribes to his God. What then is God? It is an abstract word, denoting the hidden power of nature. Or it is a mathematical point, that has neither length, breadth, nor thickness. David Hume, speaking of theologians, has ingeniously observed, that they have discovered the solution to the famous problem of Archimedes, a point in the heavens, whence they move the world. 27. Some remarkable contradictions in theology. Religion prostrates men before a being, who, without extension, is infinite, and fills all with his immensity; a being all-powerful, who never executes his will; a being sovereignly good, who creates only disquietudes; a being the friend of order, and in whose government all is in confusion and disorder. What then can we imagine can be the God of theology? 28. To adore God is to adore a fiction. To avoid all embarrassment, we are told, that it is not necessary to know what God is, that we must adore him, that we are not permitted to extend our views to his attributes. But before we know that we must adore a God, must we not know certainly that he exists? But how can we assure ourselves that he exists, if we never examine whether the various qualities attributed to him do really exist and agree in him? Indeed, to adore God is to adore only the fictions of one's own imagination, or rather, it is to adore nothing. 29. Atheism is authorized by the infinity of God. In view of confounding things the more, theologians have not declared what their God is; they tell us only what he is not. By means of negations and abstractions, they think they have composed a real and perfect being. Mind is that which is not body. An infinite being is a being who is not finite. A perfect being is a being who is not imperfect. Indeed, is there any one who can form real ideas of such a mass of absence of ideas? That which excludes all idea, can it be anything but nothing? To pretend that the divine attributes are beyond the reach of human conception, is to grant that God is not made for man. To assure us that in God all is infinite, is to own that there can be nothing common to him and his creatures. If there be nothing common to God and his creatures, God is annihilated for man, or, at least, rendered useless to him. God, they say, has made man intelligent, but he has not made him omniscient. Hence it is inferred that he has not been able to give him faculties sufficiently enlarged to know his divine essence. In this case it is evident that God has not been able nor willing to be known by his creatures. By what right, then, would God be angry with beings who were naturally incapable of knowing the divine essence? God would be evidently the most unjust and capricious of tyrants, if he should punish an atheist for not having known what, by his nature, it was impossible he should know. 30. Believing not safer than not believing in God. To the generality of men, nothing renders an argument more convincing than fear. It is therefore that theologians assure us we must take the safest part; that nothing is so criminal as incredulity; that God will punish without pity every one who has the temerity to doubt his existence; that his severity is just, since madness or perversity can only make us deny the existence of an enraged monarch, who without mercy avenges himself on atheists. If we coolly examine these threatenings, we shall find they always suppose the thing in question. They must first prove the existence of a God, before they assure us it is safest to believe, and horrible to doubt or deny his existence. They must then prove that it is possible and consistent, that a just God cruelly punishes men for having been in a state of madness, that prevented their believing the existence of a being, whom their perverted reason could not conceive. In a word, they must prove, that an infinitely just God can infinitely punish the invincible and natural ignorance of man with respect to the divine nature. Do not theologians reason very strangely? They invent phantoms, they compose them of contradictions, they then assure us, it is safest not to doubt the existence of these phantoms they themselves have invented. According to this mode of reasoning, there is no absurdity, which it would not be more safe to believe, than not to believe. All children are born atheists. They have no idea of God. Are they, then, criminal on account of their ignorance? At what age must they begin to believe in God? It is, you say, at the age of reason. But at what time should this age commence? Besides, if the profoundest theologians lose themselves in the divine nature, which they do not presume to comprehend, what ideas must man have of him? 31. Belief in God is a habit acquired in infancy. Men believe in God only upon the word of those who have no more idea of him than themselves. Our nurses are our first theologians. They talk to children of God as if he were a scarecrow. They teach them from the earliest age to join their hands mechanically. Have nurses, then, more true ideas of God than the children whom they teach to pray? 32. Belief in God is a prejudice of successive generations. Religion, like a family estate, passes with its encumbrances from parents to children. Few men in the world would have a God, had not pains been taken in infancy to give them one. Each would receive from his parents and teachers the God whom they received from theirs, but each, agreeably to his disposition, would arrange, modify, and paint him in his own manner. 33. On the origin of prejudices. The brain of man, especially in infancy, is like soft wax, fit to receive every impression that is made upon it. Education furnishes him with almost all his ideas at a time when he is incapable of judging for himself. We believe we have received from nature, or have brought with us at birth, the true or false ideas, which, in a tender age, had been instilled into our minds, and this persuasion is one of the greatest sources of errors. 34. On the effects of prejudices. Prejudice contributes to cement in us the opinions of those who have been charged with our instruction. We believe them much more experienced than ourselves. We suppose they are fully convinced of the things which they teach us. We have the greatest confidence in them. By the care they have taken of us in infancy, we judge them incapable of wishing to deceive us. These are the motives that make us adopt 1,000 errors, without other foundation than the hazardous authority of those by whom we have been brought up. The prohibition likewise of reasoning upon what they teach us by no means lessens our confidence, but often contributes to increase our respect for their opinions. 35. Theology must be instilled before the age of reason. Divines act very wisely in teaching men their religious principles before they are capable of distinguishing truth from falsehood, or their left hand from their right. It would be as difficult to instill into the mind of a man 40 years old the extravagant notions that are given to us of the divinity, as to eradicate them from the mind of him who had imbibed them from infancy. 36. The wonders of nature do not prove the existence of God. It is observed that the wonders of nature are sufficient to lead us to the existence of a God, and fully to convince us of this important truth. But how many are there in the world who have the time, capacity, or disposition necessary to contemplate nature and meditate her progress? Men, for the most part, pay no regard to it. The peasant is not struck with the beauty of the sun, which he sees every day. The sailor is not surprised at the regular motion of the ocean. He will never draw from it theological conclusions. The phenomena of nature prove the existence of a God only to some prejudiced men, who have been early taught to behold the finger of God in everything whose mechanism could embarrass them. In the wonders of nature, the unprejudiced philosopher sees nothing but the power of nature, the permanent and various laws, the necessary effects of different combinations of matter infinitely diversified. 37. Nature may be explained by natural causes. Is there anything more surprising than the logic of these divines who, instead of confessing their ignorance of natural causes, seek beyond nature, in imaginary regions, a cause much more unknown than that nature, of which they can form at least some idea? To say that God is the author of the phenomena of nature, is it not to attribute them to an occult cause? What is God? What is a spirit? They are causes of which we have no idea. O wise divines! Study nature and her laws, and since you can there discover the action of natural causes, go not to those that are supernatural, which, far from enlightening, will only darken your ideas, and make it utterly impossible that you should understand yourselves. 38. Nature may be explained by natural causes. Nature, you say, is totally inexplicable without a God. That is to say, to explain what you understand very little, you have need of a cause, which you understand not at all. You think to elucidate what is obscure by doubling the obscurity, to solve difficulties by multiplying them. O enthusiastic philosophers! To prove the existence of a God, write complete treatises of botany, enter into a minute detail of the parts of the human body, launch forth into the sky, to contemplate the revolution of the stars, then return to the earth to admire the course of waters. Behold with transport the butterflies, the insects, the polypi, and the organized atoms, in which you think you discern the greatness of your God. All these things will not prove the existence of God. They will prove only that you have not just ideas of the immense variety of matter, and of the effects producible by its infinitely diversified combinations that constitute the universe. They will prove only your ignorance of nature, that you have no idea of her powers, when you judge her incapable of producing a multitude of forms and beings, of which your eyes, even with the assistance of microscopes, never discern but the smallest part. In a word, they will prove, that for want of knowing sensible agents, or those possible to know, you find it shorter to have recourse to a word expressing an inconceivable agent. End of section 3. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 4 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 4. Parts 39 to 52. 39. The world has never been created. Matter moves of itself. We are gravely and repeatedly told that there is no effect without a cause, that the world did not make itself. But the universe is a cause, it is not an effect, it is not a work. It has not been made, because it is impossible that it should have been made. The world has always been. Its existence is necessary. It is its own cause. Nature, whose essence is visibly to act and produce, requires not, to discharge her functions, an invisible mover, much more unknown than herself. Matter moves by its own energy, by a necessary consequence of its heterogeneity. The diversity of motion, or modes of mutual action, constitutes alone the diversity of matter. We distinguish beings from one another only by the different impressions or motions which they communicate to our organs. 40. The world has never been created. Matter moves of itself. You see that all is action in nature, and yet pretend that nature, by itself, is dead and without power. You imagine that this all, essentially acting, needs a mover. What then is this mover? It is a spirit, a being absolutely incomprehensible and contradictory. Acknowledge, then, that matter acts of itself, and cease to reason of your spiritual mover, who has nothing that is requisite to put it in action. Return from your useless excursions. Enter again into a real world. Keep to second causes, and leave to divines their first cause, of which nature has no need, to produce all the effects you observe in the world. 41. Motion is essential to matter, no spiritual mover. It can be only by the diversity of impressions and effects, which bodies make upon us, that we feel them, that we have perceptions and ideas of them, that we distinguish one from another, that we assign them properties. Now, to see or feel an object, the object must act upon our organs. This object cannot act upon us without exciting some motion in us. It cannot excite motion in us if it not be in motion itself. At the instant I see an object, my eyes are struck by it. I can have no conception of light and vision without motion communicated to my eye from the luminous, extended, colored body. At the instant I smell something, my sense is irritated or put in motion by the parts that exhale from the odoriferous body. At the moment I hear a sound, the tympanum of my ear is struck by the air, put in motion by a sonorous body, which would not act if it were not in motion itself. Whence it evidently follows that without motion I can neither feel, see, distinguish, compare, judge, nor occupy my thoughts upon any subject whatever. We are taught that the essence of a thing is that from which all its properties flow. Now it is evident that all the properties of bodies, of which we have ideas, are owing to motion, which alone informs us of their existence, and gives us the first conceptions of them. I cannot be informed of my own existence, but by the motions I experience in myself. I am therefore forced to conclude that motion is as essential to matter as extension, and that matter cannot be conceived without it. Should any person deny that motion is essential and necessary to matter, they cannot, at least, help acknowledge that bodies, which seem dead and inert, produce motion of themselves, when placed in a fit situation to act upon one another. For instance, phosphorus, when exposed to the air, immediately takes fire. Meal and water, when mixed, ferment. Thus dead matter begets motion of itself. Matter has then the power of self-motion, and nature, to act, has no need of a mover, whose pretended essence would hinder him from acting. 42. The existence of man does not prove the existence of God. Whence comes man? What is his origin? Did the first man spring ready formed from the dust of the earth? Man appears, like all other beings, a production of nature. Whence came the first stones, the first trees, the first lions, the first elephants, the first ants, the first acorns? We are incessantly told to acknowledge and revere the hand of God, of an infinitely wise, intelligent, and powerful Maker, in so wonderful a work as the human machine. I readily confess, that the human machine appears to me surprising. But as man exists in nature, I am not authorized to say that his formation is above the power of nature. But I can much less conceive of this formation, when, to explain it, I am told, that a pure spirit, who has neither eyes, feet, hands, head, lungs, mouth, nor breath, made man by taking a little clay and breathing upon it. We laugh at the savage inhabitants of Paraguay for calling themselves the descendants of the moon. The divines of Europe call themselves the descendants or the creation of a pure spirit. Is this pretension any more rational? Man is intelligent, thence it is inferred that he can be the work only of an intelligent being, and not of a nature, which is void of intelligence. Although nothing is more rare than to see man make use of this intelligence, of which he seems so proud, I will grant that he is intelligent, that his wants develop this faculty, that society especially contributes to cultivate it. But I see nothing in the human machine, and in the intelligence with which it is endued, that announces very precisely the infinite intelligence of the Maker to whom it is ascribed. I see that this admirable machine is liable to be deranged. I see that his wonderful intelligence is then disordered, and sometimes totally disappears. I infer that human intelligence depends upon a certain disposition of the material organs of the body, and that we cannot infer the intelligence of God any more from the intelligence of man, than from his materiality. All that we can infer from it is, that God is material. The intelligence of man no more proves the intelligence of God, than the malice of man proves the malice of that God, who is the pretended maker of man. In spite of all the arguments of divines, God will always be a cause contradicted by its effects, or of which it is impossible to judge by its works. We shall always see evil, imperfection, and folly result from such a cause, that is said to be full of goodness, perfection, and wisdom. 43. Neither man nor the universe are the effects of chance. What, you will say, is intelligent man, is the universe, and all it contains, the effect of chance? No. I repeat it, the universe is not an effect, it is the cause of all effects. Every being it contains is the necessary effect of this cause, which sometimes shows us its manner of acting, but generally conceals its operations. Men use the word chance to hide their ignorance of true causes, which, though not understood, act not less according to certain laws. There is no effect without a cause. Nature is a word used to denote the immense assemblage of beings, various matter, infinite combinations, and diversified motions that we behold. All bodies, organized or unorganized, are necessary effects of certain causes, Nothing in nature can happen by chance. Everything is subject to fixed laws. These laws are only the necessary connection of certain effects with their causes. One atom of matter cannot meet another by chance. This meeting is the effect of permanent laws, which cause every being necessarily to act as it does, and hinder it from acting otherwise in given circumstances. To talk of the fortuitous concourse of atoms, or to attribute some effects to chance, is merely saying that we are ignorant of the laws by which bodies act, meet, combine, or separate. Those who are unacquainted with nature, the properties of beings, and the effects which must necessarily result from the concurrence of certain causes, think that everything takes place by chance. It is not chance that has placed the sun in the center of our planetary system. It is by its own essence that the substance, of which it is composed, must occupy that place, and thence be diffused. 44. Order of the universe does not prove the existence of a God. The worshippers of a God find, in the order of the universe, an invincible proof of the existence of an intelligent and wise being, who governs it. But this order is nothing but a series of movements necessarily produced by causes or circumstances, which are sometimes favorable, and sometimes hurtful to us. We approve of some, and complain of others. Nature uniformly follows the same round, that is, the same causes produce the same effects, as long as their action is not disturbed by other causes, which force them to produce different effects. When the operation of causes, whose effects we experience, is interrupted by causes, which, though unknown, are not the less natural and necessary, we are confounded. We cry out, "A miracle!" and attribute it to a cause, much more unknown than any of those acting before our eyes. The universe is always in order. It cannot be in disorder. It is our machine that suffers when we complain of disorder. The bodies, causes, and beings, which this world contains, necessarily act in the manner in which we see them act, whether we approve or disapprove of their effects. Earthquakes, volcanoes, inundations, pestilences, and famines are effects, as necessary or as much in the order of nature as the fall of heavy bodies, the courses of rivers, the periodical motions of the seas, the blowing of the winds, the fruitful rains, and the favorable effects, for which men praise God, and thank him for his goodness. To be astonished that a certain order reigns in the world, is to be surprised that the same causes constantly produce the same effects. To be shocked at disorder is to forget that when things change, or are interrupted in their actions, the effects can no longer be the same. To wonder at the order of nature is to wonder that anything can exist. It is to be surprised at anyone's own existence. What is order to one being is disorder to another. All wicked beings find that everything is in order, when they can with impunity put everything in disorder. They find, on the contrary, that everything is in disorder, when they are disturbed in the exercise of their wickedness. 45. Order of the universe does not prove the existence of a God. Upon supposition that God is the author and mover of nature, there could be no disorder with respect to him. Would not all the causes that he should have made necessarily act according to the properties, essences, and impulses given them? If God should change the ordinary course of nature, he would not be immutable. If the order of the universe, in which man thinks he sees the most convincing proof of the existence, intelligence, power, and goodness of God, should happen to contradict itself, one might suspect his existence, or, at least, accuse him of inconsistency, impotence, want of foresight and wisdom in the arrangement of things. One would have a right to accuse him of an oversight in the choice of the agents and instruments which he makes, prepares, and puts in action. In short, if the order of nature proves the power and intelligence of the Deity, disorder must prove his weakness, instability, and irrationality. You say that God is omnipresent, that he fills the universe with his immensity, that nothing is done without him, that matter could not act without his agency. But in this case you admit that your God is the author of disorder, that it is he who deranges nature, that he is the father of confusion, that he is in man, and moves him at the moment he sins. If God is everywhere, he is in me, he acts with me, he is deceived with me, he offends God with me, and combats with me the existence of God. O theologians, you never understand yourselves when you speak of God. 46. Absurd to adore a divine intelligence. In order to have what we call intelligence, it is necessary to have ideas, thoughts, and wishes. To have ideas, thoughts, and wishes, it is necessary to have organs. To have organs, it is necessary to have a body. To act upon bodies, it is necessary to have a body. To experience disorder, it is necessary to be capable of suffering. Whence it evidently follows, that a pure spirit can neither be intelligent, nor affected by what passes in the universe. Divine intelligence, ideas, and views have, you say, nothing common with those of men. Very well. How then can men judge, right or wrong, of these views, reason upon these ideas, or admire this intelligence? This would be to judge, admire, and adore that of which we can have no ideas. To adore the profound views of divine wisdom, is it not to adore that of which we cannot possibly judge? To admire these views, is it not to admire without knowing why? Admiration is always the daughter of ignorance. Men admire and adore only what they do not comprehend. 47. Qualities given God contrary to the essence attributed to him. All those qualities ascribed to God are totally incompatible with a being who, by his very essence, is void of all analogy with human beings. It is true, the divines imagine they extricate themselves from this difficulty by exaggerating the human qualities, attributed to the divinity. They enlarge them to infinity, where they cease to understand themselves. What results from this combination of man with God? A mere chimera, of which, if anything be affirmed, the phantom, combined with so much pains, instantly vanishes. Dante, in his poem upon Paradise, relates that the Deity appeared to him under the figure of 3 circles, forming an iris, whose lively colors generated each other, but that looking steadily upon the dazzling light, he saw only his own figure. While adoring God, it is himself that man adores. 48. Qualities given God contrary to the essence attributed to him. Ought not the least reflection suffice to prove, that God can have none of the human qualities, all ties, virtues, or perfections? Our virtues and perfections are consequences of the modifications of our passions. But has God passions as we have? Again, our good qualities consist in our dispositions toward the beings with whom we live in society. God, according to you, is an insulated being. God has no equals, no fellow beings. God does not live in society. He wants the assistance of no one. He enjoys an unchangeable felicity. Admit, then, according to your own principles, that God cannot have what we call virtues, and that man cannot be virtuous with respect to him. 49. Absurd to say that the human race is the object of the universe. Man, wrapped up in his own merit, imagines the human race to be the sole object of God in creating the universe. Upon what does he found this flattering opinion? We are told, that man is the only being endued with intelligence, which enables him to know the Deity, and to render him homage. We are assured that God made the world only for his own glory, and that it was necessary that the human species should come into this plan, that there might be some one to admire his works, and glorify him for them. But according to these suppositions, has not God evidently missed his object? First, man, according to yourselves, will always labor under the completest impossibility of knowing his God, and the most invincible ignorance of his divine essence. Secondly, a being, who has no equal, cannot be susceptible of glory, for glory can result only from the comparison of one's own excellence with that of others. Thirdly, if God be infinitely happy, if he be self-sufficient, what need has he of the homage of his feeble creatures? Fourthly, God, notwithstanding all his endeavors, is not glorified, but, on the contrary, all the religions in the world represent him as perpetually offended. Their sole object is to reconcile sinful, ungrateful, rebellious man with his angry God. 50. God is not made for man, nor man for God. If God be infinite, he has much less relation with man than man with ants. Would the ants reason pertinently concerning the intentions, desires, and projects of the gardener? Could they justly imagine that a park was planted for them alone by an ostentatious monarch, and that the sole object of his goodness was to furnish them with a superb residence? But, according to theology, man is, with respect to God, far below what the vilest insect is to man. Thus, by theology itself, which is wholly devoted to the attributes and views of the divinity, theology appears a complete folly. 51. Untrue, that the object of the universe was to render man happy. We are told that in the formation of the universe, God's only object was the happiness of man. But in a world made purposely for him, and governed by an omnipotent God, is man in reality very happy? Are his enjoyments durable? Are not his pleasures mixed with pains? Are many persons satisfied with their fate? Is not man continually the victim of physical and moral evils? Is not the human machine, which is represented as a masterpiece of the Creator's skill, liable to derangement in 1,000 ways? Should we be surprised at the workmanship of a mechanic, who should show us a complex machine, ready to stop every moment, and which, in a short time, would break in pieces of itself? 52. What is called Providence is a word without meaning. The generous care displayed by the Deity in providing for the wants and watching over the happiness of his beloved creatures is called Providence. But when we open our eyes, we find that God provides nothing. Providence sleeps over the greater part of the inhabitants of this world. For a very small number of men who are supposed to be happy, what an immense multitude groan under oppression and languish in misery! Are not nations forced to deprive themselves of bread to administer to the extravagances of a few gloomy tyrants, who are no happier than their oppressed slaves? At the same time that our divines emphatically expatiate upon the goodness of Providence, while they exhort us to repose our confidence in her, do we not hear them, at the sight of unforeseen catastrophes, exclaim that Providence sports with the vain projects of man, that she frustrates their designs, that she laughs at their efforts, that profound wisdom delights to bewilder the minds of mortals? But shall we put confidence in a malignant Providence, who laughs at and sports with mankind? How will one admire the unknown ways of a hidden wisdom, whose manner of acting is inexplicable? Judge of it by effects, you will say. We do, and find that these effects are sometimes useful and sometimes hurtful. Men think they justify Providence by saying that in this world there is much more good than evil to every individual of mankind. Supposing the good we enjoy from Providence is to the evil as 100 to 10, will it not still follow that, for 100 degrees of goodness, Providence possesses 10 of malignity, which is incompatible with the supposed perfection of the divine nature? Almost all books are filled with the most flattering praises of Providence, whose attentive care is highly extolled. It would seem as if man, to live happily here below, needed not his own exertions. Yet without his own labor, man could subsist hardly a day. To live, he is obliged to sweat, toil, hunt, fish, and labor without intermission. Without these second causes, the first cause, at least in most countries, would provide for none of our wants. In all parts of the globe, we see savage and civilized man in a perpetual struggle with Providence. He is necessitated to ward off the strokes directed against him by Providence, in hurricanes, tempests, frosts, hailstorms, inundations, droughts, and the various accidents which so often render useless all his labors. In a word, we see man continually occupied in guarding against the ill offices of that Providence, which is supposed to be attentive to his happiness. A bigot admired divine Providence for wisely ordering rivers to pass through those places where men have built large cities. Is not this man's reasoning as rational as that of many learned men, who incessantly talk of final causes, or who pretend that they clearly perceive the beneficent views of God in the formation of all things? End of section 4. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 5 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 5. Parts 53 through 62. 53. This pretended Providence is the enemy of man. Do we see then that Providence so very sensibly manifests herself in the preservation of those admirable works which we attribute to her? If it is she who governs the world, we find her as active in destroying as in forming, in exterminating as in producing. Does she not every moment destroy by thousands the very men to whose preservation and welfare we suppose her continually attentive? Every moment she loses sight of her beloved creature. Sometimes she shakes his dwelling, sometimes she annihilates his harvests, sometimes she inundates his fields, sometimes she desolates them by a burning drought. She arms all nature against man. She arms man himself against his own species, and commonly terminates his existence in anguish. Is this, then, what is called preserving the universe? If we could view without prejudice the equivocal conduct of Providence towards the human race and all sensible beings, we should find, that far from resembling a tender and careful mother, she resembles rather those unnatural mothers, who instantly forgetting the unfortunates of their licentious love, abandon their infants as soon as they are born, and who, content with having borne them, expose them helpless to the caprice of fortune. The Hottentots in this respect are much wiser than other nations, who treat them as barbarians and refuse to worship God, because they say, if he often does good, he often does evil. Is not this manner of reasoning more just and conformable to experience than that of many men who are determined to see, in their God, nothing but goodness, wisdom, and foresight, and who refuse to see that the innumerable evils, of which this world is the theatre, must come from the same hand which they kiss with delight? 54. The world is not governed by an intelligent being. Common sense teaches that we cannot and ought not to judge of a cause, but by its effects. A cause can be reputed constantly good, only when it constantly produces good. A cause, which produces both good and evil, is sometimes good and sometimes evil. But the logic of theology destroys all this. According to that, the phenomena of nature, or the effects we behold in this world, prove to us the existence of a cause infinitely good, and this cause is God. Although this world is full of evils, although disorder often reigns in it, although men incessantly repine at their hard fate, we must be convinced that these effects are owing to a beneficent and immutable cause, and many people believe it, or feign believe. Everything that passes in the world proves to us in the clearest manner that it is not governed by an intelligent being. We can judge of the intelligence of a being only by the conformity of the means which he employs to attain his proposed object. The object of God is the happiness of man; yet a like necessity governs the fate of all sensible beings who are born only to suffer much, enjoy little, and die. The cup of man is filled with joy and bitterness. Good is everywhere attended with evil. Order gives place to disorder. Generation is followed by destruction. If you say that the designs of God are mysterious, and that his ways are impenetrable, I answer that, in this case, it is impossible to judge whether God be intelligent. 55. God cannot be considered immutable. You pretend that God is immutable. What then produces a continual instability in this world, which you make his empire? Is there a state subject to more frequent and cruel revolutions than that of this unknown monarch? How can we attribute to an immutable God, sufficiently powerful to give solidity to his works, a government in which everything is in continual vicissitude? If I imagine I see a God of uniform character in all the effects favourable to my species, what kind of a God can I see in their continual misfortunes? You tell me it is our sins which compel him to punish. I answer that God, according to yourselves, is then not immutable, since the sins of men force him to change his conduct towards them. Can a being who is sometimes provoked and sometimes appeased be constantly the same? 56. Good and evil are the necessary effects of natural causes. The universe can be only what it is. All sensible beings in it enjoy and suffer; that is, are moved sometimes in an agreeable and sometimes in a disagreeable manner. These effects are necessary. They result necessarily from causes, which act only according to their properties. These effects necessarily please or displease by the consequence of nature. This same nature compels me to avoid, avert, and resist some things, and to seek, desire, and procure others. In a world where everything is necessary, a God, who remedies nothing, who leaves things to run in their necessary course, is he anything but destiny or necessity personified? It is a deaf and useless God who can effect no change in general laws, to which he is himself subject. Of what importance is the infinite power of a being who will do but very little in my favor? Where is the infinite goodness of a being indifferent to happiness? Of what service is the favor of a being who is able to do an infinite good, does not do even a finite one? 57. The consolations of theology and paradise are imaginary. When we ask why so many miserable objects appear under the government of a good God, we are told, by way of consolation, that the present world is only a passage designed to conduct man to a happier one. The divines assure us that the earth we inhabit is a state of trial. In short, they shut our mouths by saying that God could communicate to his creatures neither impossibility nor infinite happiness, which are reserved for himself alone. Can such answers be satisfactory? First, the existence of another life is guaranteed to us only by the imagination of man, who, by supposing it, have only realized the desire they have of surviving themselves in order to enjoy hereafter a purer and more durable happiness. Secondly, how can we conceive that a God, who knows everything, and must be fully acquainted with the dispositions of his creatures, should want so many experiments in order to be sure of their dispositions? Thirdly, according to the calculations of their chronologists, our earth has existed 6,000 or 7,000 years. During that time nations have experienced calamities. History exhibits the human species at all times tormented and ravaged by tyrants, conquerors, and heroes, by wars, inundations, famines, plagues, etc. Are such long trials, then, likely to inspire us with very great confidence in the secret views of the Deity? Do such numerous and constant evils give a very exalted idea of the future state his goodness is preparing for us? Fourthly, if God is so kindly disposed, as he is asserted to be, without giving men infinite happiness, could he not at least have communicated the degree of happiness of which finite beings are susceptible here below? To be happy, must we have an infinite or divine happiness? Fifthly, if God could not make men happier than they are here below, what will become of the hope of a paradise, where it is pretended that the elect will forever enjoy ineffable bliss? If God neither could nor would avert evil from the earth, the only residence we can know, what reason have we to presume that he can or will avert evil from another world, of which we have no idea? Epicurus observed, either God would remove evil out of this world and cannot, or he can and will not, or he has neither the power nor will, or, lastly, he has both the power and will. If he has the will and not the power, this shows weakness, which is contrary to the nature of God. If he has the power and not the will, it is malignity. And this is no less contrary to his nature. If he is neither able nor willing, he is both impotent and malignant, and consequently cannot be God. If he be both, willing and able, which alone is consonant to the nature of God, Whence comes evil, or why does he not prevent it? Reflecting minds are still waiting for a reasonable solution of these difficulties, and our divines tell us that they will be removed only in a future life. 58. Another romantic reverie. We are told of a pretended scale of beings. It is supposed that God has divided his creatures into different classes, in which each enjoys the degree of happiness of which it is susceptible. According to this romantic arrangement, from the oyster to the celestial angels, all beings enjoy a happiness which is suitable to their nature. Experience explicitly contradicts this sublime reverie. In this world all sensible beings suffer and live in the midst of dangers. Man cannot walk without hurting, tormenting, or killing a multitude of sensible beings which are in his way, while he himself is exposed, at every step, to a multitude of evils, foreseen or unforeseen, which may lead him to destruction. During the whole course of his life he is exposed to pains. He is not sure a moment of his existence, to which he is so strongly attached, and which he regards as the greatest gift of the divinity. 59. Vain that theology attempts to clear its God from human defects. The world, it will be said, has all the perfection of which it is susceptible. Since it is not God who made it, it must have great qualities and great defects. But we answer that as the world must necessarily have great defects, it would have been more comfortable to the nature of a good God not to have created a world which he could not make completely happy. If God was supremely happy before the creation of the world, and could have continued to be supremely happy without creating the world, why did he not remain at rest? Why must man suffer? Why must man exist? Of what importance is his existence to God? Nothing or something. If man's existence is not useful or necessary to God, why did God make man? If man's existence is necessary to God's glory, he had need of man. He was deficient in something before man existed. We can pardon an unskilful workman for making an imperfect work, because he must work, well or ill, upon penalty of starving. This workman is excusable, but God is not. According to you, he is self-sufficient. If so, why does he make men? He has, you say, everything requisite to make man happy. Why then does he not do it? Confess that your God has more malice than goodness, unless you admit that God was necessitated to do what he has done, without being able to do it otherwise. Yet you assure us that God is free. You say also that he is immutable, although it was in time that he began and ceased to exercise his power, like the inconstant beings of this world. O theologians, vain are your efforts to free your God from defects. This perfect God has always some human imperfections. 60. Impossible to believe God is of infinite goodness and power. Is not God master of his favors? Can he not give them? Can he not take them away? It does not belong to his creatures to require reasons for his conduct. He can dispose of the works of his own hands as he pleases. Absolute sovereign of mortals, he distributes happiness or misery, according to his good pleasure. Such are the solutions given by theologians to console us for the evils which God inflicts upon us. We reply, that a God, who is infinitely good, cannot be master of his favors, but would by his nature be obliged to bestow them upon his creatures; that a being, truly beneficent, cannot refrain from doing good; that a being, truly generous, does not take back what he is given, and that every man, who does so, dispenses with gratitude, and has no right to complain of finding ungrateful men. How can the odd and capricious conduct, which theologians ascribe to God, be reconciled with religion, which supposes a covenant or mutual engagements between God and men? If God owes nothing to his creatures, they, on their part, can owe nothing to their God. All religion is founded upon the happiness that men think they have a right to expect from the Deity, who is supposed to say to them, "Love me, adore me, obey me, and I will make you happy." Men, on their part, say to him, "Make us happy, be faithful to your promises, and we will love you, we will adore you, and obey your laws." By neglecting the happiness of his creatures, distributing his favors according to his caprice, and retracting his gifts, does not God break the covenant which serves as the basis of all religion? Cicero has justly observed that, "if God is not agreeable to man, he cannot be his God." Goodness constitutes deity. This goodness can be manifested to man only by the blessings he enjoys. As soon as he is unhappy, this goodness disappears, and with it the divinity. An infinite goodness can be neither limited, partial, nor exclusive. If God be infinitely good, he owes happiness to all his creatures. The unhappiness of a single being would suffice to annihilate unbounded goodness. Under an infinitely good and powerful God, is it possible to conceive that a single man should suffer? One animal, or mite, that suffers, furnishes invincible arguments against divine providence and its infinite goodness. 61. Impossible to believe God is of infinite goodness and power. According to theology, the afflictions and evils of this life are chastisements, which guilty men incur from the hand of God. But why are men guilty? If God is omnipotent, does it cost him more to say, "Let everything in the world be in order, let all my subjects be good, innocent, and fortunate," than to say, "Let everything exist"? Was it more difficult for this God to do his work well than badly? Religion tells us of a hell, that is, a frightful abode, where, notwithstanding his goodness, God reserves infinite torments for the majority of men. Thus, after having rendered mortals very unhappy in this world, religion tells them that God can render them still more unhappy in another. The theologian gets over this by saying that the goodness of God will then give place to his justice. But a goodness, which gives place to the most terrible cruelty, is not an infinite goodness. Besides, can a God, who, after having been infinitely good, becomes infinitely bad, be regarded as an immutable being? Can we discern the shadow of clemency or goodness in a God filled with implacable fury? 62. Theology's God a monster of absurdity and injustice. Divine justice, as stated by our divines, is undoubtedly a quality very proper to cherish in us the love of the divinity. According to the ideas of modern theology, it is evident that God has created the majority of men, with the sole view of putting them in a fair way to incur eternal punishment. Would it not have been more conformable to goodness, reason, and equity, to have created only stones or plants, and not to have created sensible beings, than to have formed men, whose conduct in this world might subject them to endless punishment in the other? A God perfidious and malicious enough to create a single man, and then to abandon him to the danger of being damned, cannot be regarded as a perfect being, but as an unreasonable, unjust, and ill-natured. Very far from composing a perfect God, theologians have formed the most imperfect of beings. According to theological notions, God would resemble a tyrant, who, after having put out the eyes of the greater part of his slaves, should shut them up in a dungeon, where, for his amusement, he would, incognito, observe their conduct through a trap door, in order to punish with rigor all those who, while walking about, should hit against each other; but who would magnificently reward the few whom he had not deprived of sight, in avoiding to run against their comrades. Such are the ideas which the dogma of gratuitous predestination gives us of the divinity. Although men are continually repeating that their God is infinitely good, yet it is evident that in reality they can believe nothing of the kind. How can we love what we do not know? How can we love a being whose character is only fit to throw us into inquietude and trouble? How can we love a being, of whom all that is said tends to render him an object of utter detestation? End of section 5. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 6 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense, by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 6, parts 63 through 75. 63. All religion inspires contemptible fears. Many people make a subtle distinction between true religion and superstition. They say that the latter is only a base and inordinate fear of the deity, but that the truly religious man has confidence in his God, and loves him sincerely, whereas the superstitious man sees in him only an enemy, has no confidence in him, and represents him to himself as a distrustful, cruel tyrant, sparing of his benefits, lavish of his chastisements. But in reality, does not all religion give us the same ideas of God? At the same time that we are told that God is infinitely good, are we not also told that he is very easily provoked, that he grants his favors to a few people only, and that he furiously chastises those to whom he has not been pleased to grant favors? 64. Religion the same as the most sombre and servile superstition. If we take our ideas of God from the nature of things, where we find a mixture of good and evil, this God, just like the good and evil of which we experience, must naturally appear capricious, inconstant, sometimes good, and sometimes malevolent, and therefore, instead of exciting our love, must generate distrust, fear, and uncertainty. There is then no real difference between natural religion and the most gloomy and servile superstition. If the theist sees God only in a favorable light, the bigot views him in the most hideous light. The folly of the one is cheerful, that of the other is melancholy, but both are equally delirious. 65. The love of God is impossible. If I draw my ideas of God from theology, he appears to inspire aversion. Devotees who tell us that they sincerely love their God are either liars or fools, who see their God only in profile. It is impossible to love a being the very idea of whom strikes us with terror, and whose judgments make us tremble. How can we, without being alarmed, look upon a God who is reputed to be barbarous enough to damn us? Let not divines talk to us of a filial, or respectful fear, mixed with love, which men ought to have for their God. A son can by no means love his father, when he knows him to be cruel enough to inflict upon him studied torments for the least faults he may commit. No man upon earth can have the least spark of love for a God who reserves chastisements, infinite in duration and violence, for 99/100ths of his children. 66. An eternally tormenting God is a most detestable being. The inventors of the dogma of eternal hell torments have made of that God, whom they call so good, the most detestable of beings. Cruelty in men is the last act of wickedness. Every sensible mind must revolt at the bare recital of the torments inflicted on the greatest criminal, but cruelty is much more apt to excite indignation when void of motives. The most sanguinary tyrants, the Caligulas, the Neros, the Domitians, had, at least, some motives for tormenting their victims. These motives were either their own safety, or the fury of revenge, or the design of frightening by terrible examples, or perhaps the vanity of making a display of their power, and the desire of satisfying a barbarous curiosity. Can a God have any of these motives? In tormenting the victims of his wrath, he would punish beings who could neither endanger his immovable power, nor disturb his unchangeable felicity. On the other hand, the punishments of the other life would be useless to the living, who cannot be witness of them. These punishments would be useless to the damned, since in hell there is no longer room for conversion, and the time of mercy is past. Whence it follows, that God, in the exercise of his eternal vengeance, could have no other end than to amuse himself, and insult the weakness of his creatures. I appeal to the whole human race. Is there a man who feels cruel enough coolly to torment? I do not say his fellow creature, but any sensible being whatever, without emolument, without profit, without curiosity, without having anything to fear? Confess then, O theologians, that, even according to your own principles, your God is infinitely more malevolent than the worst of men. Perhaps you will say that infinite offences deserve infinite punishments. I answer, that we cannot offend a God whose happiness is infinite; that the offences of finite beings cannot be infinite; that a God, who is unwilling to be offended, cannot consent that the offences of his creatures should be eternal; that a God, infinitely good, can neither be infinitely cruel, nor grant his creatures an infinite duration, solely for the pleasure of eternal torments. Nothing but the most savage barbarity, the most egregious roguery, or the blindest ambition, could have imagined the doctrine of eternal punishments. If there is a God, whom we can offend or blaspheme, there are not upon earth greater blasphemers than those who dare to say, that this same God is a tyrant, perverse enough to delight, during eternity, in the useless torments of his feeble creatures. 67. Theology is a tissue of palpable contradictions. To pretend that God can be offended at the actions of men is to annihilate all the ideas which divines endeavour to give us, in other respects, of this being. To say that man can trouble the order of the universe, that he can kindle the thunder in the hands of his God, that he can defeat his projects, is to say that man is stronger than his God, that he is the arbiter of his will, that it depends upon him to change his goodness into cruelty. Theology continually pulls down with one hand what it erects with the other. If all religion is founded upon a God, who is provoked and appeased, all religion is founded on a palpable contradiction. All religions agree in exalting the wisdom and infinite power of the Deity; but no sooner do they display his conduct, than we see nothing but imprudence, want of foresight, weakness, and folly. God, it is said, created the world for himself, and yet, hitherto, he has never been able to make himself suitably honored by it. God created men in order to have, in his dominions, subjects to render him their homage, and yet we see men in continual revolt against him. 68. The pretended works of God do not prove divine perfections. They incessantly extol the divine perfections, and when we demand proofs of them, they point to his works, in which, they assure us, these perfections are written in indelible characters. All these works are, however, imperfect and perishable. Man, who is ever regarded as the most marvelous work, as the masterpiece of the Deity, is full of imperfections, which render him disagreeable to the eyes of the Almighty Being, who formed him. This surprising work often becomes so revolting and odious to its author, that he is obliged to throw it into the fire. But if the fairest of God's works is imperfect, how can we judge of the divine perfections? Can a work, with which the author himself is so little pleased, induce us to admire the ability of its maker? Man, considered in a physical sense, is subject to 1,000 infirmities, to numberless evils, and to death. Man, considered in a moral sense, is full of faults, yet we are unceasingly told that he is the most beautiful work of the most perfect of beings. 69. The perfection of God and the pretended creation of angels. In creating beings more perfect than men, it appears that heretofore God has not better succeeded, nor given stronger proofs of his perfection. Do we not see in many religions that angels have even attempted to dethrone him? God proposed the happiness of angels and men, yet he has never been able to render happy either angels or men. The pride, malice, sins, and imperfections of the creatures have always opposed the will of the perfect Creator. 70. Theology preaches omnipotence of its God, yet makes impotent. All religion is obviously founded upon this principle, that God does what he can, and man what he will. Every system of religion presents to us an unequal combat between the Deity on one part, and his creatures on the other, in which the former never comes off to his honor. Notwithstanding his omnipotence, he cannot succeed in rendering the works of his hands such as he would have them. To complete the absurdity, there is a religion which pretends that God himself has died to redeem mankind, and yet men are not farther from anything than they are from what God would have them. 71. Per all religious systems, God is capricious and foolish. Nothing is more extravagant than the part theology makes the divinity act in every country. Did he really exist, we should see in him the most capricious and senseless being. We should be compelled to believe that God made the world only to be the theatre of his disgraceful wars with his creatures, that he created angels, men, and demons, only to make adversaries against whom he might exercise his power. He renders men free to offend him, malicious enough to defeat his projects, too obstinate to submit, and all this merely for the pleasure of being angry, appeased, reconciled, and of repairing the disorder they have made. Had the Deity at once formed his creatures such as he would have them, what pains would he not have spared himself, or, at least, from what embarrassments would he not have relieved his theologians? Every religion represents God as busy only in doing himself evil. He resembles those empirics who inflict upon themselves wounds to have an opportunity of exhibiting to the public the efficacy of their ointment. But we see not, that the Deity has hitherto been able radically to cure himself of the evil which he suffers from man. 72. It is absurd to say that evil does not proceed from God. God is the author of all, and yet we are assured that evil does not come from God. Whence then does it come? From man. But who made man? God. Evil then comes from God. If he had not made man as he is, moral evil or sin would not have existed in the world. The perversity of man is therefore chargeable to God. If man has power to do evil, or to offend God, we are forced to infer that God chooses to be offended, that God, who made man, has resolved that man shall do evil; otherwise man would be an effect contrary to the cause, from which he derives his being. 73. The foreknowledge of God proves his cruelty. Man ascribes to God the faculty of foreseeing, or knowing beforehand whatever will happen. But this prescience seldom turns to his glory, nor protects him from the lawful reproaches of man. If God foreknows the future, must he not have foreseen the fall of his creatures? If he resolved in his decrees to permit this fall, it is undoubtedly because it was his will that this fall should take place, otherwise it could not have happened. If God's foreknowledge of the sins of his creatures had been necessary or forced, one might suppose, that he has been constrained by his justice to punish the guilty; but enjoying the faculty of foreseeing, and the power of predetermining everything, did it not depend upon God not to impose upon himself cruel laws, or, at least, could he not dispense with creating beings, whom he might be under the necessity of punishing, and rendering unhappy by a subsequent decree? Of what consequence is it, whether God has destined men to happiness or misery by an anterior decree, an effect of his prescience, or by a posterior decree, an effect of his justice? Does the arrangement of his decrees alter the fate of the unhappy? Would they not have the same right to complain of a God, who, being able to omit their creation, has notwithstanding created them, although he plainly foresaw that his justice would oblige him sooner or later to punish them? 74. Absurdity of the stories concerning original sin and Satan. Man, you say, when he came from the hand of God, was pure, innocent, and good, but his nature has been corrupted, as a punishment for sin. If man, when just out of the hands of his God, could sin, his nature was imperfect. Why did God suffer him to sin, and his nature to be corrupted? Why did God permit him to be seduced, well knowing that he was too feeble to resist temptation? Why did God create Satan, an evil spirit, a tempter? Why did not God, who wishes so much good to the human race, annihilate once for all so many evil genii, who are natural enemies of our happiness? Or rather, why did God create evil spirits, whose victories and fatal influence over mankind he must have foreseen? In fine, by what strange fatality in all religions of the world has the evil principle such a decided advantage over the good principle, or the divinity? 75. The devil, like religion, was invented to enrich the priests. There is related an instance of simplicity, which does honor to the heart of an Italian monk. One day, while preaching, this pious man thought he must announce to his audience, that he had, thank heaven, at last discovered by dint of meditation a sure way of rendering all men happy. "The devil," said he, "tempts men only to have in hell companions of his misery. Let us therefore apply to the Pope, who has the keys of heaven and hell. Let us prevail upon him to pray to God, at the head of the whole Church, to consent to a reconciliation with the devil, to restore him to favor, to reinstate him in his former rank, which cannot fail to put an end to his malicious projects against mankind." Perhaps the honest monk did not see, that the devil is at least as useful as God to the ministers of religion. They have too much interest in their dissensions, to be instrumental in an accommodation between two enemies, upon whose combats their own existence and revenues depend. Let men cease to be tempted and to sin, and the ministry of priests will be useless. Manichaeism is evidently the hinge of every religion, but, unhappily, the devil, invented to clear the Deity from the suspicion of malice, proves to us every moment the impotence or unskilfulness of his celestial adversary. Section 6. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 7 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 7. Parts 76 through 80. 76. God has no right to punish man. The nature of man, it is said, was necessarily liable to corruption. God could not communicate to him impeccability, which is an inalienable attribute of his divine perfection. But if God could not make man impeccable, why did he give himself the pains to make man, whose nature must necessarily be corrupted, and who must consequently offend God? On the other hand, if God himself could not make human nature impeccable, by what right does he punish men for not being impeccable? It can be only by the right of the strongest, but the right of the strongest is called violence, and violence cannot be compatible with the justest of beings. God would be supremely unjust, should he punish men for not sharing with him his divine perfections, or for not being able to be gods like him. Could not God at least have communicated to all men that kind of perfection of which their nature is susceptible? If some men are good, or render themselves agreeable to their God, why has not that God done the same favor, or given the same dispositions, to all beings of our species? Why does the number of the wicked so much exceed the number of the good? Why, for one friend, has God 10,000 enemies, in a world which it depended entirely upon him to people with honest men? If it be true, that in heaven God designs to form a court of saints, of elect, or of men who shall have lived upon earth conformably to his views, would he not have had a more numerous, brilliant, and honorable assembly, had he composed it of all men, to whom, in creating them, he could grant the degrees of goodness necessary to attain eternal happiness? Finally, would it not have been shorter not to have made man, than to have created him a being full of faults, rebellious to his Creator, perpetually exposed to cause his own destruction by a fatal abuse of his liberty? Instead of creating men, a perfect God ought to have created only angels very docile and submissive. Angels, it is said, are free; some have sinned, but at any rate all have not abused their liberty by revolting against their master. Could not God have created only angels of the good kind? If God has created angels, who have not sinned, could he not have created impeccable men, or men who should never abuse their liberty? If the elect are incapable of sinning in heaven, could not God have made impeccable men upon earth? 77. It is absurd to say that the conduct of God a mystery. Divines never fail to persuade us, that the enormous distance which separates God and man necessarily renders the conduct of God a mystery to us, and that we have no right to interrogate our Master. Is this answer satisfactory? Since my eternal happiness is at stake, have I not a right to examine the conduct of God himself? It is only in hope of happiness that men submit to the authority of a God. A despot, to whom men submit only through fear, a master whom they cannot interrogate, a sovereign totally inaccessible, can never merit the homage of intelligent beings. If the conduct of God is a mystery, it is not made for us. Man can neither adore, admire, respect, nor imitate conduct, in which everything is inconceivable, or of which he can often form only revolting ideas; unless it is pretended that we ought to adore everything of which we are forced to be ignorant, and that everything which we do not know becomes for that reason an object of admiration. Divines, you never cease telling us, that the designs of God are impenetrable; that his ways are not our ways, nor his thoughts our thoughts; that it is absurd to complain of his administration, of the motives and springs of which we are totally ignorant; that it is presumption to tax his judgments with injustice, because we cannot comprehend them. But when you speak in this strain, do you not perceive that you destroy with your own hands all your profound systems, whose only end is to explain to us the ways of the divinity, which you say are impenetrable? Have you penetrated his judgments, his ways, his designs? You dare not assert it, and though you reason about them without end, you do not comprehend them any more than we do. If by chance you know the plan of God, which you wish us to admire, while most people find it so little worthy of a just, good, intelligent and reasonable being, no longer say, this plan is impenetrable. If you are as ignorant of it as we are, have some indulgence for those who ingenuously confess they comprehend nothing in it, or that they see in it nothing divine. Cease to persecute for opinions, of which you understand nothing yourselves. Cease to defame each other for dreams and conjectures, which everything seems to contradict. Talk to us of things intelligible and really useful to men, and no longer talk to us of the impenetrable ways of God, about which you only stammer and contradict yourselves. By continually speaking of the immense depths of divine wisdom, forbidding us to sound them, saying it is insolence to cite God before the tribunal of our feeble reason, making it a crime to judge our Master, divines teach us nothing but the embarrassment they are in, when it is required to account for the conduct of a God, whose conduct they think marvellous, only because they are utterly incapable of comprehending it themselves. 78. Ought we look for consolation from the author of our misery? Physical evil is commonly regarded as a punishment for sin. Diseases, famines, wars, earthquakes, are means which God uses to chastise wicked men. Thus they make no scruple of attributing these evils to the severity of a just and good God. But do not these scourges fall indiscriminately upon the good and bad, upon the impious and devout, upon the innocent and guilty? How, in this proceeding, would they have us admire the justice and goodness of a being, the idea of whom seems comforting to so many wretches, whose brain must undoubtedly be disordered by their misfortunes, since they forget that their God is the arbiter, the sole disposer of the events of this world? This being the case, ought they not to impute their sufferings to him, into whose arms they fly for comfort? Unfortunate father! Thou consolest thyself in the bosom of Providence, for the loss of a dear child, or beloved wife, who made thy happiness. Alas! dost thou not see that thy God has killed them? Thy God has rendered thee miserable, and thou desirest thy God to comfort thee for the dreadful afflictions he has sent thee. The chimerical or supernatural notions of theology have so succeeded in destroying, in the minds of men, the most simple, dear, and natural ideas, that the devout, unable to accuse God of malice, accustom themselves to regard the several strokes of fate as indubitable proofs of celestial goodness. When in affliction, they are ordered to believe that God loves them, that God visits them, that God wishes to try them. Thus religion has attained the art of converting evil into good. A profane person said with reason, "If God Almighty thus treats those whom he loves, I earnestly beseech him never to think of me." Men must have received very gloomy and cruel ideas of their God, who is called so good, to believe that the most dreadful calamities and piercing afflictions are marks of his favour. Would an evil genius, a demon, be more ingenious in tormenting his enemies, than the God of goodness sometimes is, who so often exercises his severity upon his dearest friends? 79. God who punishes the faults which he might have prevented. What shall we say of a father who, we are assured, watches without intermission over the preservation and happiness of his weak and short-sighted children, and who yet leaves them at liberty to wander at random among rocks, precipices, and waters, who rarely hinders them from following their inordinate appetites, who permits them to handle, without precaution, murderous arms at the risk of their life? What should we think of the same father, if, instead of imputing to himself the evil that happens to his poor children, he should punish them for their wanderings in the most cruel manner? We should say, with reason, that this father is a madman, who unites injustice to folly. A God, who punishes faults, which he could have prevented, is a being deficient in wisdom, goodness, and equity. A foreseeing God would prevent evil, and thereby avoid having to punish it. A good God would not punish weaknesses, which he knew to be inherent in human nature. A just God, if he made man, would not punish him for not being made strong enough to resist his desires. To punish weakness is the most unjust tyranny. Is it not calumniating a just God to say that he punishes men for their faults, even in the present life? How could he punish beings, whom it belonged to him alone to reform, and who, while they have not grace, cannot act otherwise than they do? According to the principles of theologians themselves, man, in his present state of corruption, can do nothing but evil, since without divine grace he is never able to do good. Now, if the nature of man, left to itself, or destitute of divine aid, necessarily determines him to evil, or renders him incapable of good, what becomes of the free will of man? According to such principles, man can neither merit nor demerit. By rewarding man for the good he does, God would only reward himself. By punishing man for the evil he does, God would punish him for not giving him grace, without which he could not possibly do better. 80. What is called free will is an absurdity. Theologians repeatedly tell us that man is free, while all their principles conspire to destroy his liberty. By endeavoring to justify the divinity, they in reality accuse him of the blackest injustice. they suppose that without grace man is necessitated to do evil. They affirm that God will punish him, because God has not given him grace to do good. Little reflection will suffice to convince us that man is necessitated in all his actions, that his free will is a chimera, even in the system of theologians. Does it depend upon man to be born of such or such parents? Does it depend upon man to imbibe or not to imbibe the opinions of his parents or instructors? If I had been born of idolatrous or Mohammedan parents, would it have depended upon me to become a Christian? Yet divines gravely assure us, that a just God will damn without pity all those to whom he has not given grace to know the Christian religion. Man's birth is wholly independent of his choice. He is not asked whether he is willing or not to come into the world. Nature does not consult him upon the country and parents she gives him. His acquired ideas, his opinions, his notions, true or false, are necessary fruits of the education which he has received, and of which he has not been the director. His passions and desires are necessary consequences of the temperament given him by nature. During his whole life, his volitions and actions are determined by his connections, habits, occupations, pleasures, and conversations, by the thoughts that are involuntarily presented to his mind; in a word, by a multitude of events and accidents which it is out of his power to foresee or prevent. Incapable of looking into futurity, he knows not what he will do. From the instant of his birth to that of his death, he is never free. You will say that he wills, deliberates, chooses, determines, and you will hence conclude that his actions are free. It is true that man wills, but he is not master of his will or his desires. He can desire and will only what he judges advantageous to himself. He can neither love pain nor detest pleasure. It will be said that he sometimes prefers pain to pleasure, but then he prefers a momentary pain with a view of procuring a greater and more durable pleasure. In this case, the prospect of a greater good necessarily determines him to forego a less considerable good. The lover does not give his mistress the features which captivate him. He is not then master of loving or not loving the object of his tenderness. He is not master of his imagination or temperament. Whence it evidently follows, that man is not master of his volitions and desires. But man, you will say, can resist his desires, therefore he is free. Man resists his desires, when the motives, which divert him from an object, are stronger than those which incline him towards it; but then his resistance is necessary. A man whose fear of dishonour or punishment is greater than his love of money, necessarily resists the desire of stealing. Are we not free when we deliberate? But are we masters of knowing or not knowing, of being in doubt or certainty? Deliberation is a necessary effect of our uncertainty respecting the consequences of our actions. When we are sure, or think we are sure, of these consequences, we necessarily decide, and we then act necessarily according to our true or false judgment. Our judgments, true or false, are not free. They are necessarily determined by the ideas we have received or which our minds have formed. Man is not free in his choice. He is evidently necessitated to choose what he judges most useful and agreeable. Neither is he free when he suspends his choice. He is forced to suspend it until he knows, or thinks he knows, the qualities of the objects presented to him, or until he has weighed the consequences of his actions. Man, you will say, often decides in favor of actions which he knows must be detrimental to himself. Man sometimes kills himself, therefore he is free. I deny it. Is man master of reasoning well or ill? Do not his reason and wisdom depend upon the opinions he has formed, or upon the conformation of his machine? As neither one nor the other depends upon his will, they are no proof of liberty. If I lay a wager that I shall do or not do a thing, am I not free? Does it not depend upon me to do it or not? No, I answer. The desire of winning the wager will necessarily determine you to do, or not to do, the thing in question. But supposing I consent to lose the wager? Then the desire of proving to me that you are free will have become a stronger motive than the desire of winning the wager, and this motive will have necessarily determined you to do, or not to do, the thing in question. But, you will say, I feel free. This is an illusion that may be compared to that of the fly in the fable who, lighting upon the pole of a heavy carriage, applauded himself for directing its course. Man, who thinks himself free, is a fly, who imagines he has power to move the universe, while he is himself unknowingly carried along by it. The inward persuasion that we are free to do or not to do a thing is but a mere illusion. If we trace the true principle of our actions, we shall find that they are always necessary consequences of our volitions and desires, which are never in our power. You think yourself free because you do what you will, but are you free to will or not to will? To desire or not to desire? Are not your volitions and desires necessarily excited by objects or qualities totally independent of you? End of section 7. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 8 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 8, Parts 81 through 91. 81. But we must not conclude that society has no right to punish. If the actions of men are necessary, if men are not free, by what right does society punish criminals? Is it not very unjust to chastise beings who could not act otherwise than they have done? If the wicked act necessarily according to the impulses of their evil nature, society, in punishing them, acts necessarily by the desire of self-preservation. Certain objects necessarily produce in us the sensation of pain. Our nature then forces us against them, and avert them from us. A tiger, pressed by hunger, springs upon the man, whom he wishes to devour. But this man is not master of his fear, and necessarily seeks means to destroy the tiger. 82. Refutation of the arguments in favor of free will. If everything be necessary, the errors, opinions, and ideas of men are fatal, and if so, how or why should we attempt to reform them? The errors of men are necessary consequences of ignorance. Their ignorance, prejudice, and credulity are necessary consequences of their experience, negligence, and want of reflection, in the same manner as delirium or lethargy are necessary effects of certain diseases. Truth, experience, reflection, and reason are remedies calculated to cure ignorance, fanaticism, and follies. But, you will ask, why does not truth produce this effect upon many disordered minds? It is because some diseases resist all remedies, because it is impossible to cure obstinate patients who refuse the remedies presented to them, because the interest of some men and the folly of others necessarily oppose the admission of truth. A cause produces its effect only when its action is not interrupted by stronger causes, which then weakens or render useless the action of the former. It is impossible that the best argument should be adopted by men who are interested in error, prejudiced in its favour, and who decline all reflection, but truth must necessarily undeceive honest minds who seek her sincerity. Truth is a cause. It necessarily produces its effects, when its impulse is not intercepted by causes which suspend its effects. 83. Refutation of the arguments in favor of free will. To deprive man of his free will, it is said, makes him a mere machine, an automaton. Without liberty he will no longer have either merit or virtue. What is merit in man? It is a manner of acting which renders him estimable in the eyes of his fellow beings. What is virtue? It is a disposition which inclines us to do good to others. What can there be contemptible in machines, or automatons, capable of producing effects so desirable? Marcus Aurelius was useful to the vast Roman Empire. By what rights would a machine despise a machine whose springs facilitate its action? Good men are springs which second society in its tendency to happiness. The wicked are ill-formed springs, which disturb the order, progress, and harmony of society. If, for its own utility, society cherishes and rewards the good, it also harasses and destroys the wicked, as useless or hurtful. 84. God, if there were a God, would not be free. The world is a necessary agent. All the beings that compose it are united to each other, and cannot act otherwise than they do, so long as they are moved by the same causes, and endued with the same properties. When they lose properties, they will necessarily act in a different way. God himself, admitting his existence, cannot be considered a free agent. If there existed a God, his manner of acting would necessarily be determined by the properties inherent in his nature. Nothing would be capable of arresting or altering his will. This being granted, neither our actions, prayers, nor sacrifices could suspend or change his invariable conduct and immutable designs, whence we are forced to infer, that all religion would be useless. 85. According to theology, man is not free a single instant. Were not divines in perpetual contradiction with themselves, they would see, that according to their hypotheses, man cannot be reputed free an instant. Do they not suppose man continually dependent on his God? Are we free when we cannot exist and be preserved without God, and when we cease to exist at the pleasure of his supreme will? If God has made man out of nothing, if his preservation is a continued creation, if God cannot, an instant, lose sight of his creature, if whatever happens to him is an effect of the divine will, if man can do nothing of himself, if all the events which he experiences are effects of the divine decrees, if he does no good without grace from on high, how can they maintain that a man enjoys a moment's liberty? If God did not preserve him in the moment of sin, how could man sin? If God then preserves him, God forces him to exist, that he may sin. 86. There is no evil and no sin, but must be attributed to God. The divinity is frequently compared to a king, whose revolted subjects are the greater part of mankind, and it is said, he has a right to reward the subjects who remain faithful to him and to punish the rebellious. This comparison is not just in any of its parts. God presides over a machine, every spring of which he has created. These springs act agreeable to the manner, in which God has formed them. He ought to impute it to his own unskilfulness, if these springs do not contribute to the harmony of the machine, into which it was his will to insert them. God is a created king, who has created to himself subjects of every description, who has formed them according to his own pleasure, whose will can never find resistance. If God has rebellious subjects in his empire, it is because God has resolved to have rebellious subjects. If the sins of men disturb the order of the world, it is because it is the will of God that this order should be disturbed. Nobody dares to call in question the divine justice, yet, under the government of a just God, we see nothing but acts of injustice and violence. Force decides the fate of nations, equity seems banished from the earth. A few men sport, unpunished, with the peace, property, liberty, and life of others. All is disorder in a world governed by a God who is said to be infinitely displeased with disorder. 87. The prayers prove dissatisfaction of the divine will. Although men are forever admiring the wisdom, goodness, justice, and beautiful order of Providence, they are, in reality, never satisfied with it. Do not the prayers, continually addressed to heaven, show that men are by no means satisfied with the divine dispensations? To pray to God for a favour shows diffidence of his watchful care. To pray to him to avert or put an end to an evil, is to endeavour to obstruct the course of his justice. To implore the assistance of God in our calamities, is to address the author himself of these calamities, to represent to him, that he ought, for our sake, to rectify his plan, which does not accord with our interest. The optimist, or he who maintains that all is well, and who incessantly cries that we live in the best world possible, to be consistent, should never pray. Neither ought he to expect another world where man will be happier. Can there be a better world than the best world possible? Some theologians have treated the optimists as impious, for having intimated that God could not produce a better world than that in which we live. According to these doctors, it is to limit the power of God, and to offer him insult. But do not these divines see, that it shows much less indignity to God to assert that he has done his best in producing this world, than to say, that being able to produce a better, he has had malice enough to produce a very bad one? If the optimist, by his system, detracts from the divine power, the theologian, who treats him as a blasphemer, is himself a blasphemer, who offends the goodness of God in espousing the cause of his omnipotence. 88. Absurd to imagine repair of misfortune in another world. When we complain of the evils, of which our world is the theatre, we are referred to the other world, where, it is said, God will make preparation for all the iniquity and misery, which, for a time, he permits here below. But if God, suffering his eternal justice to remain at rest for a long time, could consent to evil during the whole continuance of our present world, what assurance have we, that during the continuance of another world, divine justice will not, in like manner, sleep over the misery of its inhabitants? The divines console us for our sufferings by saying, that God is patient, and that his justice, though often slow, is not the less sure. But do they not see that patience is incompatible with a just, immutable, and omnipotent being? Can God then permit injustice even for an instant? To temporize with a known evil announces either weakness, uncertainty, or collusion. To tolerate evil, when one has power to prevent it, is to consent to the commission of evil. 89. Theology justifies the evil permitted by its God. Divines everywhere exclaim that God is infinitely just, but that his justice is not the justice of man. Of what kind or nature then is this divine justice? What idea can I form of a justice which so often resembles injustice? Is it not to confound all ideas of just and unjust, to say that what is equitable in God is iniquitous in his creatures? How can we receive for our model a being whose divine perfections are precisely the reverse of human? God, it is said, is sovereign arbiter of our destinies. His supreme power, which nothing can limit, justly permits him to do with the works of his own hands according to his good pleasure. A worm, like a man, has no right even to complain. This arrogant style is evidently borrowed from the language used by the ministers of tyrants, when they stop the mouths of those who suffer from their violences. It cannot then be the language of the ministers of a God whose equity is highly extolled. It is not made to be imposed upon a being who reasons. Ministers of a just God, I will inform you then, that the greatest power cannot confer upon your God himself the right of being unjust even to the vilest of his creatures. A despot is not a God. A God, who arrogates to himself the right of doing evil, is a tyrant. A tyrant is not a model for men. He must be an object execrable to their eyes. Is it not indeed strange, that in order to justify the divinity, they make him every moment the most unjust of beings? As soon as we complain of his conduct, they think to silence us by alleging that God is master, which signifies that God, being the strongest, is not bound by ordinary rules. But the right of the strongest is the violation of all rights. It seems right only to the eyes of a savage conqueror, who in the heat of his fury imagines that he may do whatever he pleases with the unfortunate victims whom he has conquered. This barbarous right can appear legitimate only to slaves blind enough to believe that everything is lawful to tyrants whom they feel too weak to resist. In the greatest calamities, do not devout persons, through a ridiculous simplicity, or rather a sensible contradiction in terms, exclaim that the Almighty is master? Thus inconsistent reasoners believe that the Almighty, a being one of whose first attributes is goodness, sends you pestilence, war, and famine. You believe that the Almighty, this good being, has the will and right to inflict the greatest evils you can bear. Cease, at least, to call your God good, when he does you evil. Say not that he is just, say that he is the strongest, and that it is impossible for you to ward off the blows of his caprice. God, say you, chastises only for our good. But what real good can result to a people from being exterminated by the plague, ravaged by wars, corrupted by the examples of perverse rulers, continually crushed under the iron sceptre of a succession of merciless tyrants, annihilated by the scourges of a bad government, whose destructive effects are often felt for ages? If chastisements are good, then they cannot have too much of a good thing. The eyes of faith must be strange eyes, if with them they see advantages in the most dreadful calamities, in the vices and follies with which our species are afflicted. 90. Jehovah exterminations prove an unjust and barbarous God. What strange ideas of divine justice must Christians have, who are taught to believe, that their God, in view of reconciling to himself the human race, guilty, though unconscious, of the sin of their fathers, has put to death his own Son, who was innocent and incapable of sinning? What should we say of a king, whose subjects should revolt, and who, to appease himself, should find no other expedient than to put to death the heir of his crown, who had not participated in the general rebellion? It is, the Christian will say, through goodness to his subjects, unable of themselves to satisfy divine justice, that God has consented to the cruel death of his Son. But the goodness of a father to strangers does not give him the right of being unjust and barbarous to his own son. All the qualities, which theology ascribes to God, reciprocally destroy one another. The exercise of one of his perfections is always at the expense of the exercise of another. Has the Jew more rational ideas of divine justice than the Christian? The pride of a king kindles the anger of heaven. Jehovah causes the pestilence to descend upon his innocent people. 70,000 subjects are exterminated, to expiate the fault of a monarch whom the goodness of God resolved to spare. 91. Is God a generous, equitable, and tender Father? Notwithstanding the various acts of injustice, with which all religions delight to blacken the divinity, men cannot consent to accuse him of iniquity. They fear, that, like the tyrants of this world, truth will offend him, and redouble upon them the weight of his malice and tyranny. They hearken therefore to their priests, who tell them, that their God is a tender Father, that this God is an equitable monarch, whose object in this world is to assure himself of the love, obedience, and respect of his subjects, who gives them liberty of acting only to afford them an opportunity of meriting his favours, and of acquiring an eternal happiness which he does not owe them. By what signs can men discover the tenderness of a father, who has given life to the greater part of his children, merely to drag out upon the earth a painful, restless, bitter existence? Is there a more unfortunate present than that pretended liberty, which, we are told, men are very liable to abuse, and thereby to incur eternal misery? End of section 8. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 9 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 9. Parts 92 through 99. 92. Man's life deposes against goodness of a pretended God. By calling mortals to life, what a cruel and dangerous part has not the Deity forced them to act? Thrown into the world without their consent, provided with a temperament of which they are not masters, animated by passions and desires inherent in their nature, exposed to snares which they have not power to escape, hurried away by events which they could not foresee or prevent, unhappy mortals are compelled to run a career which may lead them to punishments horrible in duration and violence. Travellers inform us that in Asia a sultan reigned, full of fantastical ideas, and very absolute in his whims. By a strange madness, this prince spent his time seated at a table, upon which were placed 3 dice and a dice-box. One end of the table was covered with pieces of silver, designed to excite the avarice of his courtiers and people. He, knowing the foible of his subjects, addressed them as follows: "Slaves, I wish your happiness. My goodness proposes to enrich you, and make you all happy. Do you see these treasures? Well, they are for you. Strive to gain them. Let each, in his turn, take the box and dice. Whoever has the fortune to throw sixes shall be master of the treasure. But I forewarn you that he who has not the happiness to throw the number required shall be precipitated forever into a dark dungeon, where my justice demands that he be burned with a slow fire." Upon this discourse of the monarch, the company look at each other affrighted. No one wishes to expose himself to so dangerous a chance. "What?" says the enraged Sultan. "Does no one offer to play? I tell you then you must. My glory requires that you should play. Play then. Obey without replying." It is well to observe that the dice of the despot are so prepared that out of 100,000 throws there is but one which can gain the number required. Thus the generous monarch has the pleasure of seeing his prison well filled and his riches seldom ravished from him. Mortals, this Sultan is your God. His treasure is heaven, his dungeon is hell, and it is you who hold the dice. 93. We owe no gratitude to what is called Providence. Divines repeatedly assure us that we owe Providence infinite gratitude for the numberless blessings it bestows. They loudly extol the happiness of existence. But, alas! how many mortals are truly satisfied with their mode of existence? If life has sweets, with how much bitterness is it not mixed? Does not a single chagrin often suffice suddenly to poison the most peaceable and fortunate life? Are there many who, if it were in their power, would begin again, at the same price, the painful career in which, without their consent, destiny has placed them? They say that existence is a great blessing. But is not this existence continually troubled with fears and maladies, often cruel and little deserved? May not this existence, threatened on so many sides, be torn from us any moment? Where is the man who has not been deprived of a dear wife, beloved child, or consoling friend, whose loss every moment intrudes upon his thoughts? There are few who have not been forced to drink of the cup of misfortune. There are few who have not desired their end. Finally, it did not depend upon us to exist or not to exist. Should the bird then be very grateful to the fowler for taking him in his net and confining him in his cage for his diversion? 94. It is folly to suppose that man is the favorite of God. Notwithstanding the infirmities and misery which man is forced to undergo, he has, nevertheless, the folly to think himself the favorite of his God, the object of all his cares, the sole end of all his works. He imagines that the whole universe is made for him. He arrogantly calls himself the king of nature, and values himself far above other animals. Mortal, upon what canst thou found thy haughty pretensions? It is, sayest thou, upon thy soul, upon thy reason, upon the sublime faculties, which enable thee to exercise an absolute empire over the beings which surround thee. But, weak sovereigns of the world, art thou sure, one moment, of the continuance of thy reign? Do not the smallest atoms of matter, which thou despisest, suffice to tear thee from thy throne, and deprive thee of life? Finally, does not the king of animals at last become the food of worms? Thou speakest of thy soul. But dost thou know what a soul is? Dost thou not see that this soul is only the assemblage of thy organs, from which results life? Wouldst thou then refuse a soul to other animals, who live, think, judge, and compare, like thee? Who seek pleasure and avoid pain, like thee? And who often have organs, which serve them better than thine? Thou boastest of thy intellectual faculties, but do these faculties, of which thou art so proud, make thee happier than other animals? Dost thou often make use of that reason in which thou gloriest, and to which religion commands thee not to listen? Are those brutes which thou disdainest, because they are less strong or less cunning than thou art, subject to mental pains, to 1,000 frivolous passions, to 1,000 imaginary wants, to which thou art a continual prey? Are they, like thee, tormented by the past, alarmed at the future? Confined solely to the present, does not what you call their instinct, and what I call their intelligence, suffice to preserve and defend them, and to supply them with all they want? Does not this instinct, of which thou speakest with contempt, often serve them better than thy wonderful faculties? Is not their peaceful ignorance more advantageous to them than those extravagant meditations and worthless researches, which render thee unhappy, and for which thy zeal urges thee even to massacre the beings of thy noble species? Finally, have these beasts, like so many mortals, a troubled imagination, which makes them fear not only death, but likewise eternal torments? Augustus, hearing that Herod, king of Judea, had put his sons to death, exclaimed, "It is much better to be Herod's hog than his son." As much may be said of man. This dear child of Providence runs far greater risks than all other animals. Having suffered much in this world, does he not imagine that he is in danger of suffering eternally in another? 95. A comparison between man and brutes. Where is the precise line of distinction between man and the animals whom he calls brutes? In what does he differ essentially from beasts? It is, we are told, by his intelligence, by the faculties of his mind, and by his reason, that man appears superior to all other animals, who, in all their actions, move only by physical impulses, in which reason has no share. But finally, brutes, having fewer wants than man, easily do without his intellectual faculties, which would be perfectly useless in their mode of existence. Their instinct is sufficient, while all the faculties of man scarcely suffice to render his existence supportable, and to satisfy the wants, which his imagination and his prejudices multiply to his torment. Brutes are not influenced by the same objects as man. They have not the same wants, desires, nor fancies; and they very soon arrive to maturity, while the mind of man seldom attains to the full enjoyment and free exercise of its faculties and to such a use of them as is conducive to his happiness. 96. There are no animals so detestable as tyrants. We are assured that the human soul is a simple substance. It should then be the same in every individual, each having the same intellectual faculties, yet this is not the case. Men differ as much in the qualities of the mind as in the features of the face. There are human beings as different from one another as man is from a horse or a dog. What conformity or resemblance do we find between some men? What an infinite distance is there between the genius of a Locke or a Newton and that of a peasant, Hottentot, or Laplander? Man differs from other animals only in his organization, which enables him to produce effects of which animals are not capable. The variety, observable in the organs of individuals of the human species, suffices to explain the differences in what is called their intellectual faculties. More or less delicacy in these organs, warmth in the blood, mobility in the fluids, flexibility or stiffness in the fibres and nerves, must necessarily produce the infinite diversity, which we observe in the minds of men. It is by exercise, habit, and education, that the mind is unfolded and becomes superior to that of others. Man, without culture and experience, is as void of reason and industry as the brute. A stupid man is one whose organs move with difficulty, whose brain does not easily vibrate, whose blood circulates slowly. A man of genius is he whose organs are flexible, whose sensations are quick, whose brain vibrates with celerity. A learned man is he whose organs and brain have been long exercised upon objects to which he is devoted. Without culture, experience, or reason, is not man more contemptible and worthy of hatred than the vilest insects or most ferocious beasts? Is there in nature a more detestable being than a Tiberius, a Nero, or a Caligula? Have those destroyers of the human race, known by the name of conquerors, more estimable souls than bears, lions, or panthers? Are there animals in the world more detestable than tyrants? 97. A refutation of the excellence of man. The superiority which man so gratuitously arrogates to himself over other animals soon vanishes in the light of reason, when we reflect on human extravagances. How many animals show more mildness, reflection, and reason than the animal who calls himself reasonable above all others? Are there among men, so often enslaved and oppressed, societies as well constituted as those of the ants, bees, or beavers? Do we ever see ferocious beasts of the same species mangle and destroy one another without profit? Do we ever see religious wars among them? The cruelty of beasts towards other species arises from hunger, the necessity of nourishment. The cruelty of man towards man arises only from the vanity of his masters and the folly of his impertinent prejudices. Speculative men, who endeavour to make us believe that all in the universe was made for man, are much embarrassed when we ask how so many hurtful animals can contribute to the happiness of man. What known advantage results to the friend of the gods from being bitten by a viper, stung by a gnat, devoured by vermin, torn in pieces by a tiger, etc.? Would not all these animals reason as justly as our theologians, should they pretend that man was made for them? 98. An Oriental Tale. An Eastern Tale. At some distance from Baghdad, a hermit, renowned for his sanctity, passed his days in an agreeable solitude. The neighboring inhabitants, to obtain an interest in his prayers, daily flocked to his hermitage, to carry him provisions and presents. The holy man, without ceasing, gave thanks to God for the blessings with which Providence loaded him. "O Allah," said he, "how ineffable is thy love to thy servants! What have I done to merit the favours that I receive from thy bounty? O monarch of the skies! O father of nature! What praises could worthily celebrate thy munificence, and thy paternal care? O Allah, how great is thy goodness to the children of men!" Penetrated with gratitude, the hermit made a vow to undertake, for the 7th time, a pilgrimage to Mecca. The war which then raged between the Persians and Turks could not induce him to defer his pious enterprise. Full of confidence in God, he sets out under the inviolable safeguard of a religious habit. He passes through the hostile troops without any obstacle. Far from being molested, he receives at every step marks of veneration from the soldiers of the two parties. At length, borne down with fatigue, he is obliged to seek refuge against the rays of a scorching sun. He rests under the cool shade of a group of palm trees. In this solitary place, the man of God finds not only an enchanting retreat, but a delicious repast. He has only to put forth his hand to gather dates and other pleasant fruits. A brook affords him the means of quenching his thirst. A green turf invites him to sleep. Upon waking, he performs the sacred ablution, and exclaims in a transport of joy, "O Allah! How great is thy goodness to the children of men!" After this perfect refreshment, the saint, full of strength and gaiety, pursues his way. It leads him across a smiling country, which presents to his eyes flowery hillocks, enamelled meadows, and trees loaded with fruit. Affected by this sight, he ceases not to adore the rich and liberal hand of Providence, which appears everywhere providing for the happiness of the human race. Going a little farther, the mountains are pretty difficult to pass, but having once arrived at the summit, a hideous spectacle suddenly appears to his view. His soul is filled with horror. He discovers a vast plain laid waste with fire and sword. He beholds it covered with hundreds of carcasses, the deplorable remains of a bloody battle, lately fought upon this field. Eagles, vultures, ravens, and wolves were greedily devouring the dead bodies with which the ground was covered. This sight plunges our pilgrim into a gloomy meditation. Heaven, by special favor, had enabled him to understand the language of beasts. He heard a wolf, gorged with human flesh, cry out in the excess of his joy, "O Allah! How great is thy goodness to the children of wolves! Thy provident wisdom takes care to craze the mind of these detestable men, who are so dangerous to our species. By an effect of thy providence, which watches over thy creatures, these destroyers cut one another's throats, and furnish us with sumptuous meals. O Allah! How great is thy goodness to the children of wolves!" 99. It is madness to see nothing but the goodness of God. A heated imagination sees in the universe only the blessings of heaven. A calmer mind finds in it both good and evil. I exist, say you, but is this existence always a good? Behold, you say, that sun which lights, this earth which for you is covered with crops and verdure, these flowers which bloom to regale your senses, these trees which bend under the weight of delicious fruits, these pure waters which run only to quench your thirst, those seas which embrace the universe to facilitate your commerce, these animals which a foreseeing nature provides for your use. Yes, I see all these things, and I enjoy them. But in many climates this beautiful sun is almost always hidden. In others, its excessive heat torments, creates storms, produces frightful diseases, and parches the fields. The pastures are without verdure, the trees without fruit, the crops are scorched, the springs are dried up. I can only with difficulty subsist, and now complain of the cruelties of nature, which to you always appear so beneficent. If these seas bring me spices, and useless commodities, do they not destroy numberless mortals, who are foolish enough to seek them? The vanity of man persuades him that he is the sole centre of the universe. He creates for himself a world and a God. He thinks himself of sufficient consequence to derange nature at his pleasure. But concerning other animals, he reasons like an atheist. Does he not imagine, that the individuals different from his own are automatons unworthy of the blessings of universal Providence, and that brutes cannot be objects of his justice or goodness? Mortals regard the happy or unhappy events, health or sickness, life or death, plenty or want, as rewards or punishments for the right use or abuse of the liberty with which they erroneously imagine themselves endowed. Do they reason in the same manner concerning the brutes? No. Although they see them under a just God enjoy and suffer, equally subject to health and sickness, live and die like themselves, it never occurs to them to ask by what crime these beasts could have incurred the displeasure of their Creator? Have not men, blinded by their religious prejudices, in order to free themselves from embarrassment, carried their folly so far as to pretend that beasts have no feeling? Will men never renounce their foolish pretensions? Will they never acknowledge that nature is not made for them? Will they never see that nature has placed equality among all beings she has produced? Will they never perceive that all organized beings are equally made to be born and die, enjoy and suffer? Finally, far from having any cause to be puffed up with their mental faculties, are they not forced to grant that these faculties often make them more unhappy than beasts, in which we find neither opinions, prejudices, vanities, nor follies, which every moment decide the welfare of man? End of section 9. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 10 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 10, parts 100 through 109. 100. What is the soul? The superiority which men arrogate over other animals is chiefly founded upon their opinion that they have the exclusive possession of an immortal soul. But ask them what this soul is, and they are puzzled. They will say it is an unknown substance, a secret power distinct from their bodies, a spirit of which they have no idea. Ask them how this spirit, which they suppose to be, like their God, wholly void of extension, could combine itself with their material bodies, and they will tell you they know nothing about it, that it is to them a mystery, that this combination is an effect of the omnipotence of God. These are the ideas that men form of the hidden, or rather imaginary substance, which they consider as the mainspring of all their actions. If the soul is a substance essentially different from the body, and can have no relation to it, their union would be, not a mystery, but an impossibility. Besides, this soul being of a nature different from the body, must necessarily act in a different manner. Yet we see that this pretended soul is sensible of the motions experienced by the body, and that these two substances, essentially different, always act in concert. You will say that this harmony is also a mystery. But I will tell you that I see not my soul, that I know and am sensible of my body only, that it is this body which feels, thinks, judges, suffers, and enjoys, and that all these faculties are necessary results of its own mechanism or organization. 101. The existence of a soul is an absurd supposition. Although it is impossible for men to form the least idea of the soul, or the pretended spirit, which animates them, yet they persuade themselves that this unknown soul is exempt from death. Everything proves to them that they feel, that they think, that they acquire ideas, that they enjoy and suffer, only by means of the senses, or material organs of the body. Admitting even the existence of this soul, they cannot help acknowledging that it depends entirely upon the body, and undergoes all its vicissitudes, and yet it is imagined that this soul has nothing in its nature similar to the body, that it can act and feel without the assistance of the body; in a word, that this soul, freed from the body, and disengaged from its senses, can live, enjoy, suffer, experience happiness, or feel excruciating torments. Upon such a tissue of absurdities is built the marvellous opinion of the immortality of the soul. If I ask what are the motives for believing the soul immortal, they immediately answer that it is because man naturally desires to be immortal. But because you desire a thing ardently, can you infer that your desire will be fulfilled? By what strange logic can we dare affirm that a thing cannot fail to happen because we ardently desire it? Are desires, begotten by the imagination, the measure of reality? The impious, you say, deprived of the flattening hope of another life, wish to be annihilated. Very well. May they not then as justly conclude from their desire that they shall be annihilated, as you may conclude from your desire that you shall exist forever? 102. It is evident that man dies in toto. Man dies, and the human body after death is no longer anything but a mass incapable of producing these motions of which the sum total constituted life. We see that it has no longer circulation, respiration, digestion, speech, or thought. It is pretended that the soul is then separated from the body, but to say that this soul, with which we are unacquainted, is the principle of life, is to say nothing, unless that an unknown power is the hidden principle of imperceptible movements. Nothing is more natural and simple than to believe that the dead man no longer lives. Nothing is more extravagant than to believe that the dead man is still alive. We laugh at the simplicity of some nations, whose customs is to bury provision with the dead under an idea that it will be useful and necessary to them in the other life. Is it then more ridiculous or absurd to suppose that men will eat after death, than to imagine that they will think, that they will be actuated by agreeable or disagreeable ideas, that they will enjoy or suffer, and that they will experience repentance or delight, after the organs, adapted to produce sensations or ideas, are once dissolved? To say that the souls of men will be happy or unhappy after death, is in other words to say, that men will see without eyes, hear without ears, taste without palates, smell without noses, and touch without hands. And persons who consider themselves very reasonable adopt these ideas. 103. Incontestable arguments against the spirituality of the soul. The dogma of the immortality of the soul supposes the soul to be a simple substance, in a word, a spirit. But I ask again, what is a spirit? It is, say you, a substance void of extension, incorruptible, having nothing common with matter. If so, how is your soul born, and how does it grow? How does it strengthen or weaken itself? How does it get disordered and grow old, in the same progression as your body? To all these questions you answer that these are mysteries. If so, you cannot understand them. If you cannot understand them, why do you decide about a thing of which you are unable to form the least idea? To believe or affirm anything, it is necessary at least to know in what it consists. To believe in the existence of your immaterial soul is to say that you are persuaded of the existence of a thing of which it is impossible for you to form any true notion. It is to believe in words without meaning. To affirm that the thing is as you say is the height of folly or vanity. 104. On the absurdity of the supernatural causes. Are not theologians strange reasoners? Whenever they cannot divine the natural causes of things, they invent what they call supernatural, such as spirits, occult causes, inexplicable agents, or rather words, much more obscure than the things they endeavor to explain. Let us remain in nature, when we wish to account for the phenomena of nature. Let us be content to remain ignorant of causes too delicate for our organs, and let us be persuaded, that by going beyond nature, we shall never solve the problems which nature presents. Even upon the hypothesis of theology, that is, supposing an all-powerful mover of matter, by what right would theologians deny that their God has power to give this matter the faculty of thought? Was it then more difficult for him to create combinations of matter, from which thought might result, than spirits who could think? At least, by supposing matter, which thinks, we should have some notions of the subject of thought, or of what thinks in us; whereas, by attributing thought to an immaterial being, it is impossible to form the least idea of it. 105. It is false that materialism degrades. It is objected against us that materialism makes man a mere machine, which is said to be very dishonorable. But will it be much more honorable for man, if we should say that he acts by the secret impulses of a spirit, or by a certain I know not what, that animates him in a manner totally inexplicable? It is easy to perceive that the supposed superiority of spirit over matter, or of the soul over the body, has no other foundation than men's ignorance of this soul, while they are more familiarized with matter, with which they imagine they are acquainted, and of which they think they can discern the origin. But the most simple movements of our bodies are to every man who studies them as inexplicable as thought. 106. It is false that materialism degrades. The high value, which so many people set upon spiritual substance, has no other motive than their absolute inability to define it intelligibly. The contempt shown for matter by our metaphysicians arises only from the circumstance, that familiarity begets contempt. When they tell us that the soul is more excellent and noble than the body, they say what they know not. 107. Idea of future life only useful to priest's trade. The dogma of another life is incessantly extolled as useful. It is maintained that even though it should be only a fiction, it is advantageous, because it deceives men, and conducts them to virtue. But is it true that this dogma makes men wiser and more virtuous? Are the nations who believe this fiction remarkable for purity of morals? Has not the visible world ever the advantage over the invisible? If those who are trusted with the instruction and government of men had knowledge and virtue themselves, they would govern them much better by realities than by fictions. But crafty, ambitious, and corrupt legislators have everywhere found it better to amuse with fables, than to teach them truths, to unfold their reason, to excite them to virtue by sensible and real motives, in fine, to govern them in a rational manner. Priests undoubtedly had reasons for making the soul immaterial. They wanted souls to people the imaginary regions which they have discovered in the other life. Material souls would, like all bodies, have been subject to dissolution. Now, if men should believe that all must perish with the body, the geographers of the other world would evidently lose the right of guiding men's souls towards that unknown abode. They would reap no profits from the hope with which they feed them, and the terrors with which they oppress them. If futurity is of no real utility to mankind, it is at least of the great utility to those who have assumed the office of conducting them thither. 108. It is false that the idea of a future life is consoling. But, it will be said, is not the dogma of the immortality of the soul comforting to beings who are often very unhappy here below? Though it should be an error, is it not pleasing? Is it not a blessing to man to believe that he shall be able to enjoy hereafter a happiness which is denied him upon earth? Thus, poor mortals, you make your wishes the measure of truth, because you desire to live forever, and to be happier, you at once conclude that you shall live forever, and that you shall be more fortunate in an unknown world than in this known world, where you often find nothing but affliction. Consent, therefore, to leave, without regret, this world which gives the greater part of you much more torment than pleasure. Submit to the order of nature, which demands that you, as well as all other beings, should not endure forever. We are incessantly told that religion has infinite consolations for the unfortunate, that the idea of the soul's immortality, and of a happier life, is very proper to elevate man, and to support him under adversity, which awaits him upon earth. It is said, on the contrary, that materialism is an afflicting system, calculated to degrade man. Then it puts him upon a level with the brutes, breaks his courage, and shows him no other prospect than frightful annihilation, capable of driving him to despair and suicide, whenever he is unhappy. The great art of theologians is to blow hot and cold, to afflict and console, to frighten and encourage. It appears by theological fictions that the regions of the other life are happy and unhappy. Nothing is more difficult than to become worthy of the abode of felicity, nothing is more easy than to obtain a place in the abode of torment, which God is preparing for the unfortunate victims of eternal fury. Have those men, who think the other life so pleasant and flattering, forgotten that, according to them, that life is to be attended with torments to the greater part of mortals? Is not the idea of total annihilation infinitely preferable to the idea of an eternal existence, attended with anguish and gnashing of teeth? Is the fear of an end more afflicting than that of having had a beginning? The fear of ceasing to exist is a real evil only to the imagination, which alone begat the dogma of another life. Christian ministers say that the idea of a happier life is joyous. Admitted. Every person would desire a more agreeable existence than he enjoys here. But if paradise is inviting, you will grant that hell is frightful. Heaven is very difficult, and hell very easy to be merited. Do you not say that a narrow way leads to the happy regions, and a broad way to the regions of misery? Do you not often say that the number of the elect is very small, and that of the reprobate very large? Is not grace, which your God grants but to a very few, necessary to salvation? Now, I assure you that these ideas are by no means consoling; that I had rather be annihilated, once for all, than to burn forever; that the fate of beasts is to me more desirable than that of the damned; that the opinion which relieves me from afflicting fears in this world appears to me more joyous than the uncertainty arising from the opinion of a God, who, master of his grace, grants it to none but his favorites, and permits all others to become worthy of eternal torment. Nothing but enthusiasm or folly can induce a man to prefer improbable conjectures attended with uncertainty and insupportable fears. 109. All religious principles are derived from the imagination. All religious principles are the work of pure imagination, in which experience and reason have no share. It is extremely difficult to combat them, because the imagination, once prepossessed by chimeras, which astonish or disturb it, is incapable of reasoning. To combat religion and its phantoms with the arms of reason is like using a sword to kill gnats. As soon as the blow is struck, the gnats and chimeras come hovering round again, and resume in the mind the place from which they were thought to have been forever banished. When we reject as too weak the proofs given of the existence of a God, they instantly oppose to the arguments, which destroy that existence, an inward sense, a deep persuasion, an invincible inclination, born in every man, which holds up to his mind, in spite of himself, the idea of an almighty being, whom he cannot entirely expel from his mind, and whom he is compelled to acknowledge, in spite of the strongest reasons that can be urged. But whoever will analyze this inward sense, upon which such stress is laid, will perceive that it is only the effect of a rooted habit, which, shutting their eyes against the most demonstrative proofs, subjects the greater part of men, and often even the most enlightened, to the prejudices of childhood. What avails this inward sense, or this deep persuasion, against the evidence, which demonstrates that whatever implies a contradiction cannot exist? We are gravely assured that the non-existence of God is not demonstrated. Yet, by all that men have hitherto said of him, nothing is better demonstrated than that this God is a chimera, whose existence is totally impossible, since nothing is more evident than that a being cannot possess qualities so unlike, so contradictory, so irreconcilable, as those which every religion upon earth attributes to the divinity. Is not the theologian's God, as well as that of the deist, a cause incompatible with the effects attributed to it? Let them do what they will, it is necessary either to invent another God, or to grant that he, who for so many ages has been held up to the terror of mortals, is at the same time very good and very bad, very powerful and very weak, unchangeable and fickle, perfectly intelligent and perfectly void of reason, of order and permitting disorder, very just and most unjust, very skilful and unskilful? In short, are we not forced to confess that it is impossible to reconcile the discordant attributes heaped upon a being of whom we cannot speak without the most palpable contradictions? Let any one attribute a single quality to the divinity, and it is universally contradicted by the effects ascribed to this cause. End of section 10. Recording by Roger Moline.